Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. The Vinland Voyages, Norsemen on the Edge of the World. You might think of knights, cathedrals, or sieges when you imagine the Middle Ages. But one of the strangest and quietest chapters of that time doesn't involve any of those things. Instead, it begins in a place you might not associate with medieval Europe at all: Greenland. In the late 10th century, Norse settlers, yes, the same ones we casually lump together as Vikings, were not only raiding the coasts of England and France, but sailing west, toward lands unknown. One such man, Eric the Red, founded the first Norse settlements in Greenland after being exiled from Iceland for murder. It's here, in this frozen frontier, that a sleepy and often overlooked outpost of medieval life began to take shape. These Greenlandic settlements weren't just camps or trading posts. They were full-fledged societies, complete with sheep farming, churches, taxes, and long-distance trade. Unlike the dramatic tales of Norse raids, life in Greenland was defined more by boredom and survival than conquest. The settlers lived in turf houses to retain heat. They grew barley in marginal conditions, and they brought with them a little bit of Europe, Christianity, social hierarchies, and even bishops. By the year 1000, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, had heard tales from another Norseman, Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had glimpsed unknown land far to the west after being blown off course. Leif decided to investigate. He sailed west, past the ice-choked coasts, and eventually landed in what we now call Vinland. While the exact location of Vinland is still debated, archaeological evidence, most notably the Norse site at Elant's Ox Meadows in Newfoundland, confirms that the Norse did, in fact, reach North America nearly 500 years before Columbus. But unlike Columbus, Leif didn't establish a lasting colony. The Norse presence in Vinland was temporary. They built houses, stored timber, and possibly traded with indigenous peoples, whom they referred to as the Skraelings. But they left. Why? One answer lies in the complexity and dullness of medieval logistics. Greenland was already far from the centers of Norse power. Vinland was another 2,000 kilometers beyond that. Supplies couldn't be easily replenished, and the Norse in Greenland were already struggling to maintain contact with Norway and Iceland. The ships they used were open-hulled, built for coasts and fjords, not for sustaining consistent transatlantic commerce. And then there was the human element. The Norse clashed with the indigenous peoples, who weren't passive recipients of this foreign arrival. The exact nature of their interactions remains mysterious, but they were clearly fraught. There were skirmishes, perhaps misunderstandings. One saga mentions a bull charging out of a ship and terrifying the locals. Another tells of women being abducted. Whatever the exact nature of these meetings, the result was not peaceful coexistence. The Norse retreated. Meanwhile, back in Greenland, the settlers continued to hang on. Their society was organized into two main settlements: the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement. Eastern and Western are misleading terms. Both were on the southwest coast of Greenland, about 500 kilometers apart. The Western Settlement was actually farther north and more vulnerable to changing climate. At its peak, the Norse Greenland population may have reached 4,000,5,000. They had churches, monasteries, and even their own bishopric, appointed by Rome. And yet, despite this infrastructure, the settlements faded into obscurity by the 15th century. Why did they disappear? Many theories have been proposed: a cooling climate, economic isolation, soil erosion, conflict with the Inuit, or even cultural rigidity. Some historians suggest the Norse refused to adapt to the Inuit methods of survival, such as seal hunting and use of kayaks, clinging instead to their sheep farming and church rituals. If true, it's a poignant lesson. Survival sometimes requires cultural flexibility more than courage. Still, the disappearance of the Greenlandic Norse was not abrupt. They dwindled. The western settlement faded first, sometime around 1350. The eastern settlement may have lasted another century. There's a haunting account of a wedding being held in Greenland, after which no further news ever came. And yet their story remained. The saga's oral histories eventually written down preserved fragments of Vinland. Some embellished, some contradictory, but all woven with details too specific to dismiss entirely. In fact, when Elance Oxmeadows was discovered in 1960, its ruins eerily matched the descriptions found in these ancient Icelandic texts. So, if the Norse really did make it to North America, long before Columbus, and if they built shelters and held feasts and skirmished with locals, why didn't they stay? Was it climate, conflict, or something more mundane like boredom, homesickness, or the endless logistical drag of maintaining a colony that no one else seemed to care about? And perhaps the more intriguing question is this: did they ever return? Or more provocatively still, did someone else follow them quietly and leave no trace at all? By the turn of the 11th century, the Norse had not only reached Greenland but had already begun eyeing new horizons. Leif Erikson's voyage to Vinland, whether it was a single expedition or part of a broader exploratory effort, was not a reckless act of adventure. It was calculated, motivated by practical needs, and constrained by the stubborn laws of medieval economics. The quiet desperation of Greenland. To understand why the Norse attempted to settle in North America, you first need to understand what they lacked. Greenland was a marginal place, beautiful, yes, but harsh and unyielding. The eastern settlement clung to narrow strips of arable land along fjords. While the Norse raised cattle, sheep, and goats, their agricultural possibilities were limited. Much of what they needed, iron, timber, cloth, even grain, had to be imported from Iceland or Norway. This fragile system worked until it didn't. Trade ships became less frequent. Europe itself was changing. The Black Death ravaged the continent in the mid-14th century. New routes opened, new powers rose, and old ones faded. For the Greenlanders, already on the fringe of the known world, this meant drifting further into obscurity. But in the early 1000s, there was still hope. The Norse believed they had found a solution: a lush land to the west, rich in timber, grapes, and possibly even furs. And that land was Vinland. What was Vinland, really? The Norse sagas describe three regions beyond Greenland: Helluland, Markland, and Vinland. Helluland, land of flat stones, is thought to be Baffin Island, cold, rocky, and not ideal for settlement. Markland, forest land, is likely Labrador, covered in forests perfect for timber. Vinland is more ambiguous. Some interpretations place it in Newfoundland, while others argue it extended as far south as Nova Scotia or even New England. The name Vinland suggests a land of vines and grapes. This has sparked considerable debate. Wild grapes aren't native to Newfoundland, but they are found in southern Nova Scotia and beyond. Some historians argue the name might come from the Old Norse word for pasture, vin, not wine. Others believe Leif Erikson's crew may have traveled farther south than previously believed. In any case, what mattered to the Norse was not wine, it was wood. Greenland had virtually no trees. A growing settlement needed timber for building, for fuel, and for ship repair. Importing it from Norway was expensive and inconsistent. But a land just a few weeks' voyage away, thick with forest, that was worth the risk. Life at Elance Oxmeadows. Elance Oxmeadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, provides the only confirmed Norse settlement in North America. Discovered in the 1960s by Helge and Ann Stein-Ingstad, the site revealed unmistakable signs of Norse presence: turf buildings, iron nails, a bronze cloak pin, and remnants of iron smelting. This was no Inuit camp, nor a random shipwreck site. It was planned. The buildings mirrored the longhouses found in Greenland and Iceland. There were workshops, living quarters, and storage spaces. Radiocarbon dating places its use around the year 1000, right in line with saga accounts. But the site was small, likely seasonal, perhaps only used for a few years. The lack of graves, permanent structures, or extensive middens waste heaps suggests that the Norse never intended it to be a full-scale colony. Rather, it functioned like a forward operating base, a logistical outpost for collecting timber and exploring further. Still, someone built those structures. They crossed a wild ocean to get there. They smelted iron, meaning they brought bog ore and the knowledge to refine it. They stayed long enough to cook, to craft, and to write a short, quiet chapter in medieval history that would be buried for nearly 1,000 years. Trading with the Skraelings. The Norse sagas speak uneasily of the Skraelings, the indigenous peoples they encountered in Vinland. These were likely ancestors of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, or even Dorset or Thule Inuit cultures, depending on the region and time. Initial encounters were often peaceful. The Norse traded red cloth, milk, and metal tools in exchange for pelts and food. But as with many early contacts, things eventually turned violent. The sagas mention attacks, ambushes, and revenge raids. One passage even describes a Norse warrior named Thorvald being killed by an arrow while exploring the coast. The Norse lacked the numbers or infrastructure to hold territory. Their settlements were small. Their ships were few. Unlike later European colonists, they didn't arrive with imperial ambitions or fleets. They came looking for resources and perhaps a new place to survive. Faced with resistance, they retreated. The decision wasn't necessarily a failure. It was pragmatic. There were safer ways to get wood and fur elsewhere, and no desperate political push from Norway to maintain a presence. The unanswered letter, did anyone know? One of the curious aspects of this story is how little it mattered at the time. Leif Erikson's voyage is never mentioned in contemporary European records. No pope blessed his journey. No monarch claimed the land. The Vinland voyages existed entirely within the Norse oral tradition. They were important, yes, but not earth-shattering. Why? Part of it was timing. In the early 1000s, Europe was fragmented. The Norse world was still transitioning from paganism to Christianity. Nation-states didn't yet exist. There was no Norway or Iceland as we think of them today. There were chieftains, earls, and local power brokers. Another reason is that the Norse operated independently. Leif Erikson didn't sail with royal sponsorship. He was acting on family initiative, building on stories and whispers from Greenland. His journey wasn't meant to rewrite world maps. It was to secure timber, explore, and maybe find a place more fertile than his frozen homeland. And for the most part, it worked. They found Vinland, they gathered wood, they fought, they retreated, and then they moved on. Vinland faded into legend. The fragile edge of history. The story of Norse America reminds us how easily history can slip through the cracks. If not for the Icelandic sagas written down centuries later, no one would have known. If not for the ruins at Elant's Ox Meadows, almost mistaken for natural formations, there'd be no proof. It raises uncomfortable questions. How many other forgotten chapters have we lost? And more hauntingly, what else did the Norse find but never tell? Could there be other sites, buried under soil and forest, still waiting to be discovered? Places where Norse hands built, lived, and vanished without a trace. By now, we've followed the Norse across the Atlantic, from the unforgiving fjords of Norway to the edge of the known world in Greenland, and finally to the mysterious shores of Vinland. But what happened after they returned to Greenland? What became of the settlers? And why did their voyages, once driven by such purpose, fade into silence? This last section of the story is not one of discovery, but of slow, inevitable disappearance. The Eastern Settlement holds on. Greenland's Eastern Settlement, despite its name, lay on the southern tip of the island, nestled in fjords where sea ice retreated just long enough each year to permit some grazing and modest crop growth. By the early 14th century, the settlement still maintained churches, sheep farms, and trade connections, albeit infrequent ones with Iceland and Norway. They kept records, they built in stone and turf, they raised cattle and wrote to bishops. At its height, the settlement had around 190 farms, 12 churches, and even a monastery. These were not the desperate remnants of a failed colony. They were functioning, if isolated, parts of medieval European society. But changes were stirring in the world beyond the ice. Europe was shifting into the late Middle Ages. Trade routes favored the Hanseatic League's ports, not distant Greenland. Climate began a slow but steady cooling trend, later dubbed the Little Ice Age. By the 1300s, Greenland's marginal land became increasingly unsustainable. Shorter summers meant less grazing. Sea ice lingered longer, disrupting the already tenuous shipping routes. And then the Western settlement vanished. The disappearance of the Western settlement. The Western settlement, the smaller of Greenland's two Norse communities, simply stopped existing. There were no dramatic records of disaster, no mass graves, no saga to mourn its end. Instead, it disappeared quietly, sometime between 1340 and 1360. Later visitors found only ruins and silence. Several theories attempt to explain this disappearance. Climate decline made farming impossible and hunting difficult. Encroachment of sea ice blocked ships from reaching them. Hostility or competition with the Inuit may have pushed them away, or worse. Isolation led to demographic collapse through starvation or migration. A compelling but overlooked theory suggests that many Norse may have left voluntarily, either returning to Iceland or merging into Inuit society. After all, survival has never been limited to a single culture or tradition. People adapt. Some speculate that intermarriage or cultural blending occurred, though physical evidence is limited. The Norse may have adopted Inuit hunting methods like kayak use and harpooning, or even their clothing, but written records offer little confirmation. What we do know is that the last recorded contact with the Western settlement was a wedding in 1408 in the Eastern settlement. After that, nothing. Last letters from a lost land. One of the most haunting aspects of Norse Greenland's decline lies in its absence from history. The sagas go quiet. The church stops sending bishops. The king of Norway, who once claimed Greenland under his dominion, shows little interest in its fate. When ships finally made the journey again in the 15th century, they found only abandoned ruins. Roofs had caved in. Farms had gone to seed. Churches stood eerily empty. The people were simply gone. No dramatic battles. No disease-ravaged remains. Just the slow erosion of a civilization forgotten by the world. A century of silence. For over 400 years, the Norse in Greenland held on. They survived famine, cold, distance, and political change. They built churches, herded sheep, held weddings, and maintained a European identity thousands of kilometers from the nearest cathedral town. And yet, their most remarkable achievement, their journey to North America, was forgotten. Unlike the voyages of Columbus or Magellan, Leif Erikson's expedition wasn't celebrated or studied. It wasn't repeated. It existed solely within the oral traditions of the sagas, many of which were not written down until 2 centuries after the events they describe. In a world increasingly obsessed with centralized power and written record, the Norse tale of Vinland became a whisper buried beneath myths of dragons, sea monsters, and strange islands. The rebirth of a legend. It wasn't until 1960 that the Norse presence in North America was definitively proven. At Elance Ox Meadows, archaeologists uncovered unmistakable Norse ruins. Not Inuit, not Basque, Norse. With turf walls, smelted iron, and artifacts matching Greenlandic sites, the discovery confirmed what many had suspected and others had dismissed as myth. For years, amateur historians, archaeologists, and adventurers had searched for Vinland. Some claimed it was in Massachusetts, others in Nova Scotia, but only Newfoundland provided the evidence. Still, Elance Aux Meadows is small, just 8 buildings, likely occupied for a decade or less. It doesn't tell us everything. It doesn't explain why the Norse came or why they left. But it confirms that they were there. They crossed the ocean using open boats, navigating by sunstones and stars, and survived in an alien land. They didn't bring an empire. They didn't bring disease or guns. They came with axes, rope, sheep, and iron. They left behind a whisper. A nightless America. So did medieval Europeans, knights, kings, crusaders ever reach the Americas before Columbus? Not in the romantic sense. There were no armored men planting banners, no cathedrals rising in the forests of Nova Scotia, no feudal conquests. But the Norse did come. They weren't knights, but they were medieval Europeans. They built homes, made tools, and explored a new world, and then they left. Why? Perhaps it was the distance, or the climate, or the resistance, or simply the silence. No one back in Europe seemed to care. No reinforcements came, no grain ships, no royal charters. And without support, a foothold cannot become a homeland. Final reflections. In the end, the story of Norse Vinland is not a tale of conquest or glory. It is a story of limits, of survival stretched thin, of ambition constrained by weather, geography, and the glacial pace of medieval communication. It reminds us that history is not always made by wars or revolutions. Sometimes, it is made by the quiet determination of people who tried, who built something in silence, and were forgotten not because they failed, but because the world moved on. And as you sit with this quiet story, perhaps you'll wonder, how many other tales of discovery have vanished, simply because no one was left to tell them? And how many people like the last Norse in Greenland disappeared not with a bang, but with a whisper into the ice and fog? Story 2, the Templar Rumors. Did knights ever set foot on American soil? You may know them from myths and movies. The Knights Templar, cloaked in white robes with crimson crosses, protectors of pilgrims and guardians of great secrets. But beneath the legend lies a quieter, more bureaucratic tale, one of banking, paperwork, and a slow-burning political collapse. Still, one particular myth has lingered. What if the Templars didn't die out? What if they fled and fled west? But before exploring that claim, we must start where the Templars ended, not in battle, but in courtrooms and cells. Who were the Knights Templar? Formed in 1119, in the wake of the First Crusade, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, commonly known as the Knights Templar, were originally tasked with protecting Christian pilgrims on the dangerous road to Jerusalem. But within decades, they became far more than that. As crusading armies faded and European nobles returned home, the Templars stayed behind. They amassed land, built castles, and managed resources across Europe and the Levant. By the 13th century, they had become one of the most powerful transnational organizations in medieval Europe. But their real strength wasn't military, it was financial. The Templars operated an early form of banking system. Pilgrims could deposit gold in Paris and withdraw it in Jerusalem. Monarchs borrowed vast sums from them. Nobles entrusted them with estates. Their network of preceptories, regional command centers, stretched across Christendom, each one part chapel, part fortress, part accounting office. They were rich, they were independent, and they answered only to the Pope. That made them inconvenient. The fall of the order. By the late 13th century, the Crusader kingdoms had crumbled. Acre, the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land, fell in 1291. The Templars, no longer serving their military purpose, returned to Europe, particularly to France, where their main treasury was located. Enter King Philip IV of France, often called Philip the Fair. Philip was broke. His wars with England and Flanders had drained the royal coffers. He had already devalued the currency, taxed the clergy, and expelled the Jews in order to confiscate their property. The Templars, with their vast wealth and political immunity, presented an attractive target. In 1307, Philip struck. At dawn on Friday, October 13th, royal agents across France arrested hundreds of Templars. The charges ranged from the serious to the absurd: heresy, idol worship, spitting on the cross, and even sexual misconduct during initiation rituals. Many of these accusations were likely fabricated, extracted under torture, or driven by political ambition. But the Templars' fate was sealed. Over the next 7 years, the order was dissolved. In 1312, under pressure from Philip, Pope Clement V officially disbanded the Knights Templar at the Council of Vienne. 2 years later, the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in Paris. The organization was gone. Or was it? The vanishing wealth. One of the most puzzling aspects of the Templar collapse is this: where did their money go? Philip seized what he could. Castles, estates, and local treasuries were absorbed into the French crown or passed to the Hospitallers, another military order. But not everything was accounted for. The Paris Temple, the order's central treasury, was said to contain vast reserves of gold and important documents. According to legend, shortly before the arrests, a fleet of Templar ships left the port of La Rochelle, carrying members and possibly treasure away. But to where? This is where speculation, myth, and fragments of fact begin to swirl. Some stories claim they fled to Scotland, where the excommunicated Robert the Bruce welcomed them. Others suggest they vanished into the Alps. But beginning in the 19th century, a more audacious theory took root: that the Templars sailed west. The American connection. The idea that Templars reached the Americas centuries before Columbus is not part of academic consensus. There is no direct archaeological evidence linking the Templars to pre-Columbian North America, and yet the theory persists. Why? It stems from a few tantalizing breadcrumbs. The Newport Tower, located in Rhode Island. This round stone structure has been alternately identified as a colonial windmill, an observatory, or something older. Some enthusiasts suggest its design matches that of medieval Templar churches in Europe. The Kensington runestone, discovered in Minnesota in 1898, this inscribed slab of stone allegedly tells of a Norse expedition in 1362. Though widely regarded as a hoax, a fringe theory connects the runestone's creators to descendants of Norse, Templar alliances. The Westford Knight, a carving found in Massachusetts, appears to resemble a medieval knight holding a sword and shield. Some claim it is a Templar memorial. Others see natural erosion. The hooked X symbol, found on runestones and gravestones in New England. This odd character has been interpreted by theorists as a secret Templar code representing bloodlines, mysticism, or hidden faith. Together, these artifacts form a speculative narrative that fleeing Templars with their ships, maps, and money sailed into the Atlantic, possibly using Norse knowledge or ports like La Rochelle to establish secret outposts in the New World. Mainstream historians argue that these connections are coincidental, misinterpreted, or forged. There is no contemporary evidence, no logs, no letters, no records linking the Templars to America. But then again, the Templars were masters of discretion. Why would they come? If the Templars did flee west, what would have driven them? Several motivations arise. Escape. Europe had turned against them. The Pope no longer protected them. The French king had them arrested and tortured. Secrecy. Their network was trained in communication, encryption, and logistics. They had ships, resources, and perhaps even maps possibly derived from Norse or Arabic sources showing lands west of Iceland. Preservation. Beyond material wealth, the Templars were rumored to guard sacred relics including, in some myths, the Holy Grail. Wouldn't such a group seek a place where no king or pope could touch them? Rebirth, in hiding they could build something new, a haven for their ideals, their symbols, their knowledge hidden in the wilderness, far from inquisitors and kings. These ideas form the backbone of countless novels, shows, and pseudo-histories. Yet they remain, at best, questions without answers. Fragments in the fog. The idea of Templars in America is appealing because it ties together so many loose ends: lost treasure, unexplained ruins, even early contact with indigenous peoples. It's a story that allows us to imagine an alternative past, one where secrets crossed the Atlantic long before Columbus. But history is not made of what-ifs. It's made of paper trails, architecture, and bones, and none of those, as yet, firmly place the Templars on American soil. Still, myths persist for a reason. Often, they grow where records go missing. So we're left with a question not about what happened, but about what could have. If the Templars had ships, motive, and maps, did they set sail for the unknown? And if they did, what did they find, and why did they never return to tell the tale? In the world of medieval history, paper is power. Letters, tax rolls, shipping manifests, these are the breadcrumbs that allow us to reconstruct the lives of people long dead. But when those records disappear, as they did with the Templars, imagination creeps into the gaps. In this section, we follow those imaginative trails not through royal archives, but through stone carvings, mysterious ruins, and coded symbols scattered across the eastern coast of North America. Many of these claims fall outside accepted academic history, but the persistence of these theories, often dull in their details, obsessive in their scrutiny, reveals something about both the myth and the mind that keeps it alive. What, if anything, do these whispers of Templars in America tell us? The Newport Tower, windmill or watchtower. Nestled in the heart of Newport, Rhode Island, stands a curious stone structure. Cylindrical with 8 pillars supporting a second story, it's long been known simply as the Newport Tower. For centuries, locals believed it was built by 17th-century settlers, likely Governor Benedict Arnold, the great-grandfather of that Benedict Arnold, who owned the land. But others weren't so sure. Beginning in the 19th century, alternative theories emerged. Some suggested that the tower resembled Templar round churches, specifically those in Europe, like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Cambridge or the Temple Church in London. Round churches were rare. They symbolized Jerusalem and were most often associated with the Knights Templar. Could the Newport Tower be the remnant of a Templar outpost? Proponents argue that its design is too sophisticated for a simple colonial windmill. Some even claim the windows align with astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, and star positions that would have had symbolic meaning for medieval Christian mystics or esoteric orders. Skeptics, however, note that no physical evidence supports a pre-colonial origin. The mortar, materials, and written references all point to 17th century construction. Governor Arnold himself mentioned the stone-built windmill in his will in 1677. Still, the mystery lingers. The structure sits quietly, passed by tourists unaware of the speculation surrounding it. A round stone structure, nothing more, or maybe something less. The Westford Knight, etched in granite or in imagination. Far inland in Westford, Massachusetts, lies a weathered patch of rock bearing what some call the Westford Knight. To the untrained eye, it's barely visible, a rough human figure holding a sword and shield, allegedly wearing a helmet. According to local legend, the carving is a medieval knight, perhaps even Sir James Gunn, a Scottish nobleman and companion of Henry Sinclair, the 14th century Earl of Orkney, whom some believe led an expedition to North America in 1398. In this telling, Sinclair, possibly Templar affiliated, and his men sailed west, landing in Nova Scotia and venturing as far south as Massachusetts. Guns supposedly died along the way, and the carving was made as a memorial. It's a compelling tale, but the stone tells few secrets. Mainstream geologists and archaeologists generally view the carving as either a natural formation or the result of 19th century weathering and later enhancements. No definitive dating has been established, and no artifacts have been found at the site. And yet, for over a century, believers have visited the stone, photographing it, tracing its contours, and linking it to Templar iconography. The nearby town has even erected a sign recognizing the legend. Is it a memorial, a hoax, or just a granite face bearing the weight of wishful thinking? The Kensington Runestone, a Viking Templar conspiracy. In Minnesota, far from any medieval trade route, a farmer named Olaf Oman unearthed a curious object in 1898, a 200-pound slab of stone with runic inscriptions. The Kensington Runestone, as it came to be known, claimed to record a Norse expedition from 1362 well before Columbus, and centuries after the last Norse voyages from Greenland. The inscription, translated, described a party of Norsemen exploring the interior of the continent. It also mentioned 10 men being killed by Skraelings, an echo of the term used in the Norse sagas. Immediately, scholars were skeptical. Linguists pointed out grammatical errors and modern-looking runes. The stone lacked any verifiable context, no settlement, tools, or remains nearby. Most dismissed it as a 19th-century hoax, perhaps part of a wave of Scandinavian-American myth-making common at the time. But then came the Templar twist. Modern theorists like Scott Wolter have proposed that the runestone was not just Norse but Templar-influenced. They point to a recurring symbol on the stone, the hooked X. The hooked X, symbol of secrets. The hooked X is a variation of the letter X, where the upper right stroke curves like a fishhook. It appears not only on the Kensington Runestone, but also on gravestones in New England and in manuscripts linked to esoteric Christian sects. Proponents of the Templar in America theory suggest that the hooked X represents sacred duality, the union of male and female, or Jesus and Mary Magdalene. In this view, it's a marker of hidden knowledge passed down by Templars, preserved by secret societies like the Freemasons or the Cistercians. Is there any evidence for this interpretation? Not in the academic sense. Most linguists and historians dismiss the hooked X as either coincidental or a modern invention. But the symbol has become a powerful motif among those seeking links between medieval orders and early American exploration. It's a symbol that asks for belief, not confirmation. Maps of mystery, the Zeno narrative. One final puzzle adds fuel to the theory. The Zeno map, allegedly published in Venice in the 1550s, but based on letters and charts from the 14th century. The map depicts islands in the North Atlantic, some real, Iceland, Greenland, others speculative or mythical, Friesland, Estetiland. According to its narrative, the Zeno brothers' Venetian navigators sailed under the command of a prince named Zichmni, who some believe was Henry Sinclair, the Scottish noble with supposed Templar ties. The story goes that Zichmni sailed west from Greenland and reached lands across the Atlantic. But again, the evidence is thin. The Zeno map may be based on earlier speculative cartography. The accompanying story is full of inconsistencies, and the identity of Zichmni remains uncertain. Still, in the absence of records, stories find fertile ground. Between history and myth. In many ways, the story of the Templars in America reflects a desire to believe in hidden truths that, beneath the dull machinery of medieval bureaucracy, something extraordinary happened. It's not surprising. The Templars vanished. Their records were seized, their leaders burned, their assets absorbed, all the hallmarks of a cover-up if one chooses to read it that way. Add in the European confusion about lands to the West Vinland, Estetiland, mythical islands like High Brassel, and the door to speculation creaks open. But speculation is not history, and yet, we find ourselves tracing faint lines in stone, symbols on graves, and legends in old towns. Perhaps we're not seeking the Templars at all, but something more. The idea that the past contains secrets, still waiting to be uncovered. So we return to the central question. If the Templars had the means to flee, and if others, like the Norse, had already blazed the trail, why wouldn't they follow it? And if they did they build something? A chapel, a refuge, a sanctuary long since buried by time and trees? As the embers of the Templar pyres cooled in Paris and their chapter houses emptied across Europe, the official story seemed complete. The order was gone, dismantled by decree, its members dead, imprisoned, or scattered. But history has always had trouble closing the book on the Knights Templar. In this final section, we look not for a lost city in the American wilderness, but at what remained, their networks, their rituals, and the curious continuity of their ideas. Because even if no Templar ever set foot on American soil, their ghosts arguably did through the people and institutions who carried forward their symbols, fears, and myths. Was the Templar Order truly destroyed, or did it survive not as an organization but as an undercurrent? Let's examine how the idea of the Templars persisted, and how that idea eventually found fertile ground in the early imagination of America. The Templar diaspora. After the order was disbanded in 1312, not all members were executed or imprisoned. Many simply melted back into society. Some joined the Knights Hospitaller, another military religious order, which inherited much of the Templars' land. Others returned to noble families, having been knights before they were monks. Some, particularly in Spain and Portugal, were absorbed into new or existing military orders created by local monarchs. The Order of Montesa in Aragon and the Order of Christ in Portugal. This last group is of particular interest. The Order of Christ, established in 1319 by King Dinis of Portugal, received much of the Templars' assets and welcomed many of its former knights. Though under papal oversight, it operated with a certain independence, and in time, it played a major role in Portugal's maritime expansion. It was under the banner of the Order of Christ that Prince Henry the Navigator, a key figure in the Age of Discovery, launched his expeditions. Here, the Templars didn't sail west, but their successors, perhaps shaped by similar training, philosophies, and maritime knowledge, did sail south and east, mapping the African coast and exploring the Atlantic. It's not proof of an American voyage, but it's a reminder. Not all of the Templar spirit was extinguished. Some of it simply changed uniforms. Masonic echoes, from brotherhood to legend. Fast forward to the 18th century. Across Europe and the American colonies, a different kind of secret society had begun to flourish. Freemasonry. Though rooted in medieval guild traditions, Freemasonry had by now become a complex network of lodges, rituals, and symbols, many drawn, quite consciously, from Templar lore. In fact, some Masonic rites claimed direct descent from the Templars. The Scottish Rite and the York Rite included degrees and ceremonies explicitly referencing the Templar order. Initiates were told they were inheriting a sacred mission interrupted by betrayal and suppression. These claims were not based on historical lineage. There's no hard evidence connecting medieval Templars to Enlightenment-era Freemasons. But again, it's the idea that mattered. A once-suppressed order of warrior monks, guardians of esoteric truths, operating in secrecy and discipline, it was the perfect founding myth for a society that valued initiation, symbols, and fraternal bonds. And then came the American Revolution. Many of its leaders, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and others, were Freemasons. They carried with them not only Enlightenment ideals, but also the symbolic language of ancient orders. Obelisks, compass and square emblems, and other Masonic motifs appeared in architecture, rituals, and even national seals. By the early 19th century, American Masons were referring to themselves as inheritors of the Templar tradition. Some Masonic orders established a Knights Templar degree, a ceremonial homage, not an armed brotherhood, but steeped in the legend. So did the Templars come to America? Not physically, but the myth of the Templars, refracted through centuries of romanticism, conspiracy, and fraternal ritual did. It helped shape American secret societies, influenced national symbolism, and kept alive the idea that hidden knowledge and ancient virtue were still at work in the world. Sacred geography, Templars and American landscape. In some cases, the myth took root in stone. As mentioned earlier, places like the Newport Tower, Westford Knight, and Kensington Runestone became focal points for those seeking physical evidence of a Templar voyage. These locations are not recognized by mainstream historians as authentic medieval structures. And yet, the public imagination continues to treat them as places of sacred mystery. They serve as waypoints in a folk geography not of towns and rivers, but of stories and suspicions. Even outside of these sites, the landscape of New England and Nova Scotia has been combed for signs of Templar activity. Strange rock arrangements, overgrown ruins, or unexplained carvings are sometimes offered as proof of a hidden medieval presence. While no definitive archaeological evidence supports these theories, they persist in popular books, documentaries, and walking tour. It's not the facts that have traveled so far, but the idea of the Templars that somewhere in America's forests or fields lies a buried continuation of something ancient. The human need for continuity. So why does the story endure? Perhaps it's because the true history of the Templars, their rise, power, and abrupt annihilation feels incomplete. A powerful, wealthy, and deeply networked organization doesn't just vanish. We instinctively look for a continuation. And America, with its vast, unexplored spaces and revolutionary origins, provided fertile soil for that continuation. The narrative is irresistible. A group of exiled warrior monks, guardians of lost knowledge, escape their destruction. They set sail, navigating by secret maps. They arrive in a new land, free from kings and popes. They plant symbols in stone, hide relics in caves, and wait for the world to catch up. Even if false, the story feels right. It mirrors the American founding myth, a break from tyranny, a new beginning, a sacred mission. That's why the Templar rumors survive, because they speak to the quiet hope that something ancient, pure, and wise made its way into the modern world and left a trace. Conclusion: a whisper, not a footprint. After 3 sections of inquiry, we must return to the original question. Did the Knights Templar ever come to America? By the standards of academic history, no. There is no verifiable evidence. No documents, no settlements, no artifacts with provenance. But in the realm of cultural history, the answer is more complex. They came not with armor or ships, but with myths. Their symbols, rituals, and legends were reborn in Masonic halls, etched into local lore, and whispered in cemeteries and libraries across the New World. If you walk quietly through Newport or Westford, or run your fingers along a weathered gravestone marked with a hooked X, you may find yourself wondering not if it's true, but why it matters. Because in the end, some of the most powerful forces in history are not armies or emperors, but ideas that refuse to die. Story 3. The Hasidic Dream, Commerce Without Glory. When we think of medieval power, we usually imagine kings, popes, and warriors. Banners flying over muddy battlefields, armored men charging into glory. But there's a quieter story, one written not in blood, but in ledgers. It's the story of the Hasidic League, a sprawling network of merchants, towns, and trade routes that stretched across the North and Baltic seas from the 13th to the 17th centuries. No thrones, no armies, no coronations. Yet the Hands controlled cities, dictated trade policy, and for a time bent northern Europe to its will. This was a medieval empire built not on conquests but on salted fish, wax, wool, and bookkeeping. And yet, for all its influence, the Hanseatic League remains an often overlooked chapter of history, its details too dull for textbooks, its impact too deep to ignore. Let's begin in the port city of Lübeck. Lübeck, the quiet capital. Perched on the Baltic coast in what is now northern Germany, Lübeck in the early 13th century was not much to look at. A modest trading port surrounded by marshland. But it had something crucial: location. Lübeck sat at the crossroads of Baltic and North Sea trade, linking Scandinavia, the German interior, and the Low Countries. From here, goods could flow westward to England, eastward to Novgorod, and southward to the Holy Roman Empire. By 1241, Lübeck had formed a formal trade alliance with Hamburg, another emerging port city. This pact became the seed of something much larger, a league of cities banding together to protect mutual commercial interests. Thus was born the Hanseatic League, or Die Hands. Within a century, over 200 cities and towns would join the network, an unprecedented alliance of urban centers, focused entirely on economic collaboration and mutual protection. They didn't march into war. They negotiated, embargoed, and quietly dominated. What was the Hanseatic League? The Hanseatic League was not a nation, nor a state, nor even a formal government. It was a confederation, a network of independent cities and merchants who agreed to coordinate trade, standardize practices, and support one another in disputes. Membership wasn't fixed. Towns joined and left depending on politics and economics. But at its height, the Hands included cities as far apart as London via the Steelyard, its Hanseatic enclave; Bergen, Norway; Novgorod, Russia; Bruges, Flanders; Riga, Latvia; and dozens of towns throughout Germany and the Baltic coast. They shared a language, Middle Low German, a practical dialect for contracts and correspondence. They shared goals: safe trade, predictable markets, and stable governance. And they shared tools: common weights and measures, standardized trading laws, and private armed fleets to protect cargo from pirates. They even held diets, assemblies, where representatives from different cities met to discuss policy. Not kings, not nobles, merchants, men who calculated risk in sacks of rye and bars of wax. The power of salted fish. It's easy to miss the scale of the Hanseatic achievement because their power came not from glamour, but from necessity. Consider salted herring. In the 14th century, fish was not a luxury, it was a dietary staple, especially during the fasting days of the Christian calendar when meat was prohibited. Cities far from the sea relied on salted and dried fish shipped in from the Baltic. The Hanseatic League monopolized this trade. They controlled the fisheries, the salt works, the ships, and the distribution. A similar story can be told for grain from the plains of Prussia and Poland, wool and cloth from England and Flanders, honey and wax from the vast forests of Eastern Europe, timber and furs from Russia and the North. The Hands acted as middlemen but also as regulators. They fixed prices, negotiated trade privileges with kings, and punished pirates or rival merchants who disrupted their systems. They didn't conquer territory. They bought influence with contracts, tariffs, and quiet pressure. Their weapon was not the sword, but the ledger. Enclaves and contours. To manage their far-flung network, the Hands established contours, formal trading outposts in foreign cities. These weren't just warehouses. They were miniature Hanseatic cities with their own laws, guilds, and infrastructure. The most famous contours were The Steelyard in London. Hanse merchants lived and worked in a walled compound on the Thames. They were exempt from English taxes and subject only to Hanseatic law. Bryggen in Bergen, Norway. A row of timber buildings where German merchants controlled the trade of dried cod and stockfish, essential to Europe's fasting economy. Novgorod's Peterhof, the easternmost outpost, trading in wax, fur, and timber. Here, the Hanse acted as a bridge between German cities and Slavic principalities. Within these contours, Hanse merchants lived as a law unto themselves. They answered not to local rulers but to the League. These communities operated in silence. No castles, no armies, just cargo lists, contracts, and the steady rhythm of supply and demand. Bureaucracy without borders. What made the Hanseatic League truly remarkable was its bureaucratic sophistication. Every ship had to follow Hanseatic codes on weight, packaging, and inspection. Every dispute was settled according to League arbitration. Ships could be embargoed, merchants banned, or towns fined for failing to uphold contracts. This quiet enforcement gave Hanse merchants a reputation for reliability. A buyer in Bruges could trust that a shipment of grain from Danzig would arrive on time, with consistent quality and fair pricing. In a medieval world of uncertainty where roads were dangerous, coins debased, and rulers unpredictable, the Hanse offered something rare: predictability. And that, more than any knightly vow or royal decree, built trust. Conflict in silence. Of course, not everyone appreciated the Hanseatic dominance. English merchants resented the Hanse's privileges in London. Kings of Denmark and Sweden tried to bypass Hanseatic control. Pirates, including the infamous Victual brothers, targeted Hanseatic ships in the Baltic. Sometimes the League fought back. They formed convoys. They blockaded ports. They even launched naval expeditions, though rarely successful. But their greatest weapon remained the trade embargo. When the Hanse shut down commerce with a city or a region, prices soared, goods vanished, and rulers took notice. In 1367, the League formed the Confederation of Cologne to wage economic war against Denmark. It worked. The Danish king was forced to grant the League sweeping trade rights. No battles, just contracts and consequences. So why have you never heard of them? The Hanseatic League faded not in drama, but in irrelevance. By the 16th century, new trade routes opened to the Atlantic. The rise of nation-states Spain, England, France shifted power away from cities to centralized monarchies. Internal disagreements, the rise of Dutch and English shipping, and the slow decline of the Baltic trade all chipped away at the League's dominance. Lübeck remained a city, so did Hamburg, but the League as a whole withered. The last Hanseatic Diet was held in 1669. Only a handful of cities bothered to send representatives. It ended not with a revolution, but with disinterest. A whisper in the ledgers. Today, the Hanse survives only in fragments. Street names and merchant houses in towns like Rostock, Gdansk, and Visby. The Hanseatic Days, an annual cultural festival celebrated by modern cities that once belonged to the League. And in the quiet influence of its methods, contracts, logistics, standardized trade that would one day evolve into modern capitalism. The Hanseatic League had no castles, no kings, and no saints. Its battles were economic. Its glory was quiet, but it reshaped Northern Europe for centuries. It reminds us that power doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears a wool tunic, carries a ledger, and sails with a cargo hold full of herring. But here's the question. If the Hanseatic League built a commercial empire without armies or kings, why didn't it last? And what did it leave behind in the towns that once lived by the rhythm of its trade? In the heart of the medieval world where most power flowed through thrones, monasteries, and militaries, the Hanseatic League built a different system. No kings commanded its armies. No peasants farmed its fields. Its cities were not bound by conquest but by contracts. Its strength came not from walls or fortresses but from agreements, shared interests, and the promise of stability. In this section, we explore how the Hanseatic League functioned as a network, how it managed its internal disputes, and how it weathered external threats not by swords, but by strategy. And slowly, we begin to see how this medieval experiment shaped a system that would outlive it, the early foundation of global capitalism. The cities that moved the goods. The Hanseatic League was not a monolith. It was a constellation of cities, each with its own character, language, and specialties, working together for mutual benefit. Let's take a closer look at some of the most important players in the Hanseatic web. Lübeck, often called the Queen of the Hands, Lübeck sat at the core of the League. It hosted most of the League's Diet's meetings and functioned as a central clearinghouse for decisions, taxes, and negotiations. Its access to both the North and Baltic Seas made it a natural hub. Hamburg, sitting on the Elbe River, Hamburg connected inland German trade to the North Sea. It specialized in salt, beer, and wool exports. Danzig, Gdansk, located on the Baltic coast of modern Poland, Danzig was essential for the grain trade. It moved agricultural goods from the Polish interior to Western Europe, becoming one of the wealthiest cities in the network. Riga and Tallinn, Reval. These Baltic ports linked the League to Russian markets via Novgorod. They dealt in wax, furs, and timber. Bruges, a vital western outpost. Bruges gave Hanse merchants access to French cloth markets and the wealthy courts of Flanders. Each city operated with its own local government and guilds, but under the umbrella of Hanseatic rules. These cities were joined not by military oaths or religious alliances, but by profit motive. The League wasn't about faith or feudalism. It was about logistics. The contour system, trading without borders. Earlier, we looked at contours, the foreign trading posts established by the Hanseatic League. These weren't informal marketplaces. They were full institutions, with administration, lodging, chapels, and regulations enforced by Hanse law. Each contour was governed by an alderman, elected by the merchants stationed there, and supported by a council. This local authority could discipline members, enforce contracts, and represent the Hanse in negotiations with local powers. Consider the Steelyard in London. Located on the north bank of the Thames, it was a walled compound where Hanse merchants lived and worked. It had its own weighing station, storage warehouses, and residential quarters. English merchants could not enter without permission. English law did not apply inside its walls. The Hanse even built their own church within the compound. In exchange for this autonomy, the Hanse guaranteed a steady flow of trade and, perhaps more importantly, predictable taxes. Monarchs tolerated the League because it offered wealth without rebellion. But this foreign autonomy created resentment. Local traders in England, Flanders, and Norway viewed the Hanseatic privileges as unfair competition, and over time, these tensions would grow. Conflict within, rivalries, resistance, and regulation. While the League presented a united front to outsiders, its internal politics were complex and often contentious. Cities competed with one another for influence. Rich ports like Cologne and Bruges occasionally refused to follow Lübeck's leadership. Merchants from inland towns had different priorities than their coastal counterparts. To maintain cohesion, the League held periodic Diets conferences where city delegates debated League policy. These meetings were slow, dull, and bureaucratic, precisely what made them effective. Compromises were reached, decisions documented, and members bound by collective agreements. Still, dissent was common. For instance, Cologne, a wealthy city on the Rhine, was expelled from the League in 1471 for violating trade policies. Bruges, once a thriving hub, fell out of favor as its river silted up, prompting Han's merchants to shift focus to Antwerp against Bruges protests. Some cities failed to contribute ships for naval defense or ignored embargoes. They were fined or temporarily expelled. The League had no army, but it had teeth. Cities that broke agreements faced boycotts, sanctions, or collective trade punishments. These measures were remarkably effective in a world where economic isolation could ruin a city faster than a siege. Pirates, kings, and the limits of power. The Hands faced its greatest challenges not from within, but from external forces, monarchs who sought to centralize power and pirates who disrupted the League's lifeblood. Shipping. One of the most significant threats came from the Victual Brothers, a band of pirate-stern privateers who operated in the Baltic Sea during the late 14th century. Initially hired by Sweden to supply its besieged cities, they quickly turned rogue, attacking Hanseatic ships and cities. In response, the League created a convoy system, merchants pooled ships, and hired armed escorts. It also negotiated with Scandinavian powers to reduce the pirate threat diplomatically. But pirates were only part of the problem. The rise of powerful monarchies, particularly in Denmark and England, challenged the League's independence. Kings grew tired of foreign merchants wielding power within their borders. In 1478, the English confiscated the Steelyard and expelled Han's merchants. Though the privileges were later restored, it marked a turning point. The Hanseatic League could not control kingdoms. It could negotiate, but not conquer. As nation-states matured, the League's decentralized model began to feel increasingly obsolete. Fading influence, from domination to decay. By the 16th century, the Hanseatic League was losing ground. Several forces contributed. New trade routes. The discovery of the Atlantic trade shifted wealth and attention to Spain, Portugal, and eventually the Dutch and English. The Baltic was no longer the center of commerce. Rise of the Dutch and English merchant fleets. These new powers had strong, centralized governments and navies. They could offer better protection and enforce global policies. Internal stagnation. The League was slow to adapt. Cities clung to outdated privileges and trade routes and failed to modernize their fleets or expand to new markets. Religious and political upheaval. The Reformation divided Hanse cities, some of which converted to Protestantism, while others remained Catholic. Unity fractured. By 1669, when the last Hanseatic Diet was held in Lubeck, only 6 cities bothered to attend. The League was no longer a power. It was a memory. The ghost of the Hanse. Today, the Hanseatic League is remembered only in names and traditions. Some cities like Lubeck, Hamburg, and Bremen still proudly call themselves Hansestadt, Hanseatic City. The Hanseatic Days of New Time, a modern cultural festival, is held each year in former League cities. The German shipping register still uses H for Hanse in certain notations. But its real legacy is invisible. Standardized contracts, protected shipping lanes, transnational trade cooperation, merchant diplomacy. The Hanse wasn't exciting. It was organized. It was slow. It was boring in the way that stability often is. But for centuries, it kept Northern Europe connected, fed, and economically stable. It showed that commerce, when structured and standardized, could do what armies and kings could not, create peace through mutual interest. But the question remains, what might the world look like today if the Hanseatic model had survived into the age of empire and industrialization? Could networks have triumphed over nations? As we conclude this story of the Hanseatic League, we arrive not at a climactic battle or sweeping revolution, but at a quiet dissolution. There was no fall in flames, no invasion, no martyrdom. The League didn't die. It just stopped mattering. Yet its influence endured, not in stone monuments or dynastic lines, but in paperwork, procedures, and principles the infrastructure of international trade and civic cooperation. In this final section, we'll explore how the Hanseatic League's legacy survived far beyond its political death. We'll follow its ideas through the age of empires and into modern capitalism, and reflect on how a group of fish traders and wool shippers laid the groundwork for a globalized world. The end without drama. By the mid-17th century, the Hanseatic League was functionally obsolete. The last official diet in 1669 was a formality. Only a handful of cities participated. Even Lübeck, the League's de facto capital, had turned inward, managing local affairs instead of continental strategy. Why such a quiet ending? Because the League had always existed in the margins. It had no military to lose, no royal line to sever. Its power had always been relational, dependent on cities choosing to collaborate, and over time, those cities simply stopped choosing. Nations had risen. Trade had gone global. The League's model, slow, consensus-based, city-centered, was no match for the centralized monarchies, state-sponsored colonialism, and joint-stock corporations of the early modern world. And yet, even in its disappearance, the Hands left behind a structure, one not of power but of method. The birth of modern trade practices. Though the Hanseatic League is rarely studied in school curriculums, many of the systems it developed were quietly adopted and expanded in the centuries that followed. 1. Standardized contracts and measurements. Hanseatic merchants used standardized terms for weights, measures, and pricing, even across borders. They pioneered early forms of bills of lading, letters of credit, and trust-based accountancy practices foundational to modern logistics. 2. Arbitration and merchant law. Internal league disputes were settled not by local courts, but by merchant arbitration panels. This laid early groundwork for transnational commercial law, including principles still seen today in organizations like the International Chamber of Commerce or WTO arbitration. 3. Trade embargoes and sanctions. Instead of war, the Hands imposed economic penalties on cities or kingdoms that disrupted trade. These embargoes functioned like early sanctions, leveraging market access as a tool of enforcement. 4. Collective bargaining power. Hands cities negotiated together, giving them far more power than they would have had individually. This idea would re-emerge centuries later in trading blocs like the European Economic Community, or the EU, a concept of unity for mutual economic benefit. 5. Information networks. Letters between Hanseatic merchants circulated market prices, port updates, and political warnings, an early form of shared business intelligence. These networks foreshadowed chambers of commerce, trade newsletters, and today's data-driven supply chains. The League's cultural legacy. Though often viewed as a purely economic force, the Hands also shaped urban identity and civic culture across Northern Europe. In many League cities, local governance evolved to reflect the merchant class's values, consensus, prudence, and documentation. Wealth wasn't in feudal landholdings, but in credit, reputation, and export balance. This had long-term effects. Cities like Hamburg, Bremen, and Lübeck retained republican traditions longer than their feudal neighbors. Even today, Hamburg and Bremen are city-states within modern Germany. Architecture in former Hanseatic towns still reflects the merchant aesthetic. Brick Gothic, efficient layouts, large warehouses facing canals or ports. The Hands also helped spread Middle Low German across trade hubs, a practical language of contracts and inventory. It faded over time, but many maritime loanwords persist in Germanic languages. Above all, the League instilled the idea that cities could govern themselves through cooperation, not conquest, that a merchant could be as powerful as a prince, just more discreet about it. The Hanseatic Revival, Romanticism and Tourism. By the 19th century, as nationalism rose in Europe, the Hanseatic League experienced a nostalgic revival, especially in Germany, where it became a symbol of past order, prosperity, and independence. Artists and writers romanticized the Hanse's steady hand during the chaotic Middle Ages. Painters depicted fleets sailing in perfect formation. Towns restored old warehouses, guild halls, and merchant homes. The 20th century saw cities like Lübeck, Wismar, and Stralsund recognized as UNESCO World Heritage Sites, preserving Hanseatic architecture. In the 1980s, the Hanseatic Days of New Time began, a yearly festival where former League cities across Europe celebrate shared heritage through food, folk music, and symbolic agreements. Over 180 towns now belong to the new Hanse, from Tartu, Estonia, to Kampen, Netherlands. It's not a political union. There are no trade policies, but there's something quietly powerful about remembering a time when trade, not war, connected Europe. Quiet lessons from a quiet empire. The story of the Hanseatic League is not one of drama. It is, in many ways, the story of what didn't happen. No wars of expansion. No royal murders. No imperial decline. And yet, the Hanse reshaped an entire region, created wealth that lasted generations, and showed how cooperation could function without central authority. In a world increasingly shaped by economic alliances, free trade agreements, and digital supply chains, the Hanseatic model feels strangely modern. It raises important questions. Can cities lead in global policy again, as they once did? Can economic cooperation survive without central enforcement? Can stability come not from dominance, but from shared interest? A thoughtful farewell. As we close this story, it's worth remembering what the Hanse taught us, not through glory, but through endurance. That networks can be stronger than empires. That trust can outlast towers. That order, even if boring, can quietly shape the world. So the next time you see a cargo ship gliding into port, or notice standardized packaging on your groceries, remember the Hanse. They didn't invent trade, but they perfected its infrastructure and left behind a world quietly built on their rules. Story 4. The Forgotten Siege of Antioch, how boredom killed more than swords did. When we think of sieges in the Middle Ages, we often imagine heroic last stands, fiery trebuchets, and armored knights scaling walls in dramatic assaults. But for the thousands of crusaders who laid siege to the city of Antioch in the year 1097, the defining enemy wasn't a blade or arrow. It was time. Time and everything that comes with it: hunger, disease, freezing nights, broken morale, and the slow rot of purpose. As the weeks dragged into months, men died not in battle but in bedrolls, starved or sick. And boredom, the quiet, gnawing kind that eats away at discipline, proved to be as deadly as any Saracen sword. This is the story of a siege rarely told in full, where logistics mattered more than heroism, and where the outcome shaped centuries of conflict to come. It began, as so many things did during the First Crusade, with a ragtag army and an impossible objective: the road to Antioch. In 1096, Pope Urban II had called for a crusade and armed pilgrimage to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule. The call was answered not just by knights, but by peasants, debtors, and adventurers, many of whom had never left their villages before. The First Crusade was not a unified force. It was a collection of armies, each led by its own lord, often more interested in plunder and glory than religious duty. They moved slowly through Europe, into the Byzantine Empire, and eventually across Asia Minor. By October 1097, the Crusaders reached Antioch, a heavily fortified city in the Orontes Valley, modern-day Turkey. It wasn't their final goal, but it was critical. Antioch was a strategic bottleneck, a massive city with towering walls, control of nearby routes, and symbolic significance as an early Christian center. Without it, the road to Jerusalem was blocked. The problem: Antioch was nearly impossible to take. The walls of stone and memory. Antioch's defenses were legendary even by medieval standards. Its triple-layered walls stretched over 12 kilometers, wrapping around a steep hillside. Over 400 towers guarded every approach. Inside, an estimated 30,000 civilians and soldiers lived under the rule of Yag-Haisian, the Seljuk Turkish governor. The Crusaders, by contrast, numbered perhaps 35,000 but with limited siege equipment, little knowledge of the terrain, and no unified command. They had no ladders, no siege towers, no battering rams. They hadn't come prepared for a siege, they'd come to fight in the open field. So they waited, and the city waited back. Hunger comes first. Sieges are not exciting, not for the attackers, and not for historians who want clean timelines. From October 1097 to June 1098, the Crusaders camped outside Antioch. At first, they tried to surround the city, but the walls were too long. They set up pickets, patrolled roads, and harassed supply lines. Then winter came. Supplies dwindled. Foraging became dangerous, with Turkish raiders picking off scouts. The land offered little. What little grain or livestock could be found was quickly hoarded or stolen. Chroniclers from the period describe scenes of desperation. Men boiling shoe leather for broth. Horses killed not in battle but for meat. Bread prices so high that men fought over crumbs. The poor dying in ditches from cold and starvation. The problem wasn't just food, it was management. The Crusader leadership squabbled constantly. Bohemond of Taranto, Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, and others each wanted command. They distrusted one another, and decisions stalled. Meanwhile, the men in the mud got hungrier and more bored. When time turns on you, a siege tests more than strength, it tests patience, and few of the Crusaders had much. Idle time is dangerous for an army. Without action, discipline collapses. Morale erodes, rumors spread, men begin to desert. Some Crusaders snuck away, heading home or toward friendlier cities. Others began fighting each other, arguments over food, over leadership, over religion. In one particularly infamous episode, a French knight ate the corpse of a fallen Saracen in full view of others. Chroniclers debate whether it was madness, starvation, or a desperate attempt to intimidate the enemy. But the effect was chilling, a once holy cause reduced to cannibalism. Even the nobility weren't immune. Internal letters reveal nobles blaming each other for the delays. The papal legate, who was supposed to mediate disputes, died likely of illness, further fragmenting leadership. And all the while, Antioch held strong. The defenders had food, they had walls, and they had time. But then something shifted. A spy, a gate, a gamble. By May 1098, the Crusaders were reaching their breaking point. Then, Bohemond, the wily Norman leader, hatched a plan. He had been secretly corresponding with a guard inside the city, an Armenian named Firouz, possibly a discontented Christian convert or a bribed mercenary. The details are murky, but what matters is this. Firouz agreed to betray Antioch. On the night of June 2nd, under cover of darkness, Bohemond led a small force to one of the towers. Firouz opened the gate. The Crusaders poured in. Surprise was total. By dawn on June 3rd, the city was theirs. The Crusaders looted Antioch with characteristic fervor. Gold, grain, weapons, it all vanished into carts and tents. Civilians were slaughtered. Mosques burned. Bohemond claimed control of the city in defiance of promises made to Byzantine Emperor Alexios. It should have been a moment of triumph. But it was only the beginning of a worse crisis. Because just as they captured the city, a new army appeared. Siege turned inward. A massive relief force under Kurbagha of Mosul, numbering perhaps 35,000 men, arrived outside Antioch intent on retaking it. Now the roles were reversed. The Crusaders, already weakened by hunger and disease, were trapped inside the city they had just conquered. The walls held, but barely. Food was scarce. The defenders, once the besiegers, now watched as their comrades died in the same ditches they had once dug. It was at this lowest point that a miracle was claimed. A peasant named Peter Bartholomew announced he had found the holy lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side. It was hidden beneath a church floor, he said, a divine sign. Some believed him, others doubted, but the effect was immediate. Morale surged. Whether planted or not, the discovery revived the army. They prepared for a final battle. Breaking the siege. On June 28, 1098, the Crusaders marched out of Antioch. Weakened, starving, divided but driven by faith, fury, and desperation. Against the odds, they routed Kurbagha's army. Disorganization and fear spread through the Turkish ranks, and the Crusaders won. How? Perhaps it was surprise. Perhaps internal divisions among Kurbagha's allies. Or perhaps the psychological boost of belief, the power of a relic, real or imagined. But they held the city. Antioch was theirs. It would become a Crusader principality, ruled by Bohemond, and a key outpost in the years to come. And then nothing. The Crusaders remained in Antioch for months. They didn't push to Jerusalem immediately. They argued, they rebuilt, they rested. Some turned back home. The great cause, the pilgrimage to reclaim the Holy Sepulchre, was stalled again by the weight of reality. Food had to be gathered, supply lines established, troops paid. A crusade, like a siege, often dies in its paperwork. And yet the siege of Antioch was pivotal. Without it, the Crusaders never would have reached Jerusalem. Without it, there would be no Crusader kingdoms, no second or third crusades, no Richard the Lionheart or Saladin. It all hinged on this bloody stalemate, this winter of waiting, this half-forgotten trial of patience and slow death. But here is the real question. Did the Crusaders win because of faith or because of treachery? Was it a holy war or simply a lesson in waiting longer than your enemy? When the Crusaders broke into Antioch in June of 1098, they expected celebration. After nearly 8 months of cold, starvation, and disease, they had taken one of the most fortified cities in the east. But instead of marching triumphantly toward Jerusalem, they found themselves trapped inside their own prize. The siege had turned inwards. A relief army now surrounded them. Morale collapsed again. The same sickness and starvation that had nearly destroyed the army outside the walls now festered inside them. In this section, we look at how faith, fear, and friction shaped the crucible of Antioch in its second phase, when the psychological weight of war surpassed the physical. Here, among the silence and dead ends, the crusade came close to falling apart. And yet, it held together barely. The siege of Antioch wasn't a story of heroism. It was a story of survival. The second siege begins. The initial fall of Antioch on June 3, 1098, had cost the Crusaders dearly. Their forces were already diminished from months of starvation, disease, and desertion. And within just 4 days, their fragile grip on the city was threatened by the arrival of Kurbagha, the powerful Atabeg of Mosul. Kurbagha's army was well-fed, organized, and included contingents from across the Muslim world: Aleppo, Damascus, and Persia. Estimates vary, but most sources place his numbers between 30,000 and 40,000, easily matching or exceeding the exhausted Christian forces. And now, those Christian forces were inside a devastated city. The Crusaders had looted Antioch, but its stores were not enough to support their army. Much of the local population had been slaughtered, and farms in the surrounding countryside were stripped bare. For the next 3.5 weeks, the Crusaders experienced the siege in reverse. This time, they were behind the walls. Starvation again. Chroniclers such as Raymond of Aguilars and Fulcher of Chartres described scenes as bleak as those from the earlier siege. Horses, already scarce, were slaughtered for food. Men boiled grass, roots, and even animal hides. Disease swept through the overcrowded quarters. Some men began to question whether this holy war had simply become a slow death sentence. The second siege saw a renewed wave of desertion. One particularly famous defector was Stephen of Blois, one of the original leaders of the crusade and son-in-law to William the Conqueror. On June 12, Stephen slipped out of Antioch under cover of night. He later encountered the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who was bringing reinforcements. Stephen advised him to turn back, falsely claiming that the crusade had failed. Alexios retreated. The Crusaders would face Kerbogha alone. This desertion would haunt Stephen's reputation and later provoke major tensions between the Crusaders and the Byzantines. But within Antioch, things were far worse than imperial politics. A city divided. Even in the face of annihilation, the Crusader leadership continued to bicker. Bohemond of Taranto wanted control of Antioch, arguing that he had secured the city through his secret negotiation with Firaz. Raymond of Toulouse, however, insisted that Antioch should be handed over to the Byzantine emperor, as agreed at the outset of the crusade. The dispute paralyzed decision-making. Each faction hoarded supplies. Soldiers began swearing loyalty to individual lords rather than the cause. The fragile unity of the First Crusade, the idea of Christendom united, was crumbling in the face of cold reality. And then in the darkest hour, a miracle arrived, or at least something that looked like one. The lance and the peasant. In late June 1098, a peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed to receive a vision from St. Andrew. According to Peter, the apostle told him the holy lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion, was buried beneath the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter in Antioch. Despite skepticism from some nobles, others supported Peter, particularly Raymond of Toulouse, who saw a potential morale-boosting symbol. On June 14, a team dug beneath the cathedral. After hours of toil in the stifling summer heat, Peter declared he had found the lance. The object he pulled from the dirt was a rusted iron spike. Whether it had been planted in advance or truly unearthed is impossible to confirm. What mattered was that it offered hope. Raymond paraded the relic through the streets. Sermons were preached. A sense of divine favor returned to the camp. It worked. A battle of belief. On June 28, 1098, the Crusaders marched out of Antioch to face Kerbogha's army. Outnumbered, malnourished, and poorly equipped, they relied on faith, not force. Peter the Hermit, one of the original instigators of the People's Crusade, led prayers. The Holy Lance was carried into battle. In a stunning upset, the Crusaders routed Kerbogha's forces. Why? Kerbogha's coalition fractured. His allies, suspicious of his ambitions, withdrew mid-battle. The Crusaders, driven by desperation and belief, fought with renewed zeal. Kerbogha failed to exploit his advantages and retreated in disorder. The miracle had come true, at least in the minds of the victors. The Crusaders, against all odds, had survived 2 sieges and defeated 2 enemies. The aftermath, victory without direction. Yet even in victory, the army fractured further. Bohemond, now firmly in control of Antioch, refused to relinquish the city to the Byzantines. The agreement to restore captured lands to Alexios was discarded, justified, in part, by Stephen of Blois, false report that the emperor had abandoned them. Raymond, disgusted, withdrew from Antioch and resumed the journey toward Jerusalem with his own forces. It would be another year before the Crusaders finally reached the Holy City. Antioch remained a Christian principality for nearly 170 years, ruled first by Bohemond and his descendants. It became a capital in the new Latin East, one of the first footholds in the Christian Crusader states. But the cost had been immense. Of the tens of thousands who set out on the crusade, only a fraction survived Antioch. And the scars ran deeper than numbers. The siege exposed the limits of religious unity, the weakness of feudal leadership, and the grim reality that suffering, not glory, defined the medieval battlefield. In the quiet between battles, perhaps the most striking feature of the siege of Antioch is what didn't happen. No grand charge broke the gates. No famous duel turned the tide. No clear villain was defeated in the end. Instead, this was a battle of attrition, improvisation, and stubborn endurance. It showed that wars weren't always won with swords. They were won with supplies, cooperation, and sometimes belief in a rusty piece of metal pulled from the ground by a starving peasant. Antioch did not fall because the Crusaders were stronger. It fell because they waited, adapted, and in the end got lucky. But the deeper question is this. If a siege can be won with forged relics and betrayal, what does that say about the nature of holy war? Was Antioch saved by God, or by a desperate man with a shovel and a story? The story of the siege of Antioch does not end with a grand coronation or the raising of banners. There were no parades, no moment of clarity or unity. Instead, the city sat scarred, divided, and starving as the surviving Crusaders turned their attention toward Jerusalem. But Antioch would never be the same again, nor would the crusade. The siege left behind splintered loyalties, new political powers, and a quietly devastating message. Victory doesn't always heal what suffering has broken. In this final section, we'll examine what happened after the siege, the political reshaping of the region, the deepening of East-West rifts, and the psychological toll of prolonged medieval warfare. We'll also explore how Antioch, though often ignored in popular histories, set precedents that echoed through the next 2 centuries of crusading and still whisper to us through ruined walls and forgotten chronicles. Bohemond's gamble. When the fighting ended, Bohemond of Taranto made his move. Despite the original oath to return all captured lands to the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I, Bohemond claimed Antioch for himself. He argued that Alexios had abandoned the crusade, thanks to the false report from Stephen of Blois, and therefore forfeited any right to the city. It was a dangerous precedent. Bohemond had used the crusade not just to reclaim holy sites, but to carve out a personal domain, and he would become the first prince of Antioch, founding one of the 4 major Crusader states in the Levant. His principality stretched along the northeastern coast of the Mediterranean and into the mountains. Strategically located, Antioch offered access to trade routes, fertile valleys, and defensible positions, but it was also surrounded by hostile Muslim territories and political rivals. The city would remain in Crusader hands until 1268, when it fell to the Mamluks. Nearly 170 years of intermittent peace, siege, and shifting alliances. Yet even from the beginning, Antioch was built on tension, not triumph. The shattered illusion of unity. The First Crusade had been pitched as a unified Christian effort, East and West joining hands to liberate the Holy Land. But Antioch exposed the cracks. Mistrust of the Byzantines deepened. Though Emperor Alexios had sent guides and supplies, the Crusaders suspected betrayal and abandonment. The siege and its aftermath only worsened this. Rival Crusader leaders Bohemond, Raymond, Godfrey pursued personal power. Each sought land and influence, rather than a single, coordinated command. The Church's spiritual authority faltered. The papal legate died during the siege, and there was no clear replacement. The miracle of the Holy Lance, so central to morale, became a source of division. In 1099, Peter Bartholomew, the peasant who had claimed to discover the lance, offered to prove its divine origin by ordeal. He walked barefoot through fire, and died days later from his burns. Whether he truly believed or sought glory remains unknown, but his death cast a long shadow. It suggested that even faith, weaponized as propaganda, had limits. Disease, trauma, and the cost of waiting. Histories of the Crusades often track movements, marches, battles, victories. But the Siege of Antioch shows another side, the physical and psychological toll of not moving. For 8 months, tens of thousands of men lived in filth, cold, and confusion. There were no front lines, no formal trenches, just tents and makeshift shelters. Many men died without ever seeing the enemy felled by. Typhus and dysentery, malnutrition and scurvy, hypothermia during freezing winter nights. And more abstractly, by mental collapse, the slow unraveling of purpose in a war with no end in sight. The very structure of medieval society began to strain. Nobles no longer led by divine right, but by who controlled the grain stores. Prayer became political. Trust evaporated. In this context, the miracle of the Holy Lance wasn't just spiritual, it was psychological triage. Historians today point to Antioch as a case study in siege trauma. Though not called that at the time, it echoes with the same symptoms: paranoia, delusion, mutiny, and a hunger not just for food, but for meaning. A city as a symbol. Antioch became a model, for better or worse, of what crusading really looked like. Messy logistics, poor planning, insufficient supplies, and reliance on luck or betrayal. Mixed motives, faith, ambition, greed, survival, all competing within the same camp. No clear resolution. Even in victory, the Crusaders suffered. Even in triumph, they fractured. It set the tone for future Crusader states, which were often underpopulated, militarily vulnerable, and riddled with political rivalry. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, founded after the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099, would be surrounded by threats for its entire existence. And Antioch, despite its proud walls and strategic value, it became a contested inheritance fought over by Western lords, Eastern Christians, and Muslim rulers alike. The unspoken lessons. The Siege of Antioch is rarely glorified. It lacks the dramatic flair of Jerusalem's capture or the tragedy of Hattin, but in many ways it was more instructive. It showed that medieval warfare was not glorious. It was bureaucratic, cold, tedious, often absurd. The heroic image of knights in shining armor fades when one reads about fighting over rotten onions or arguing theology in the mud. And it challenges the modern narrative of crusading as a purely religious conflict. Certainly, religion was central, but it was also a cover for ambition, for feudal rivalry, for the raw need to survive. In the mud outside Antioch, the idea of holy war broke down. Echoes in the modern world. The echoes of Antioch extend into surprising places. The city itself still stands, modern Antakya, in Turkey, though its medieval walls have mostly crumbled. Earthquakes in time did what armies couldn't. In modern military studies, the siege is examined not for tactics, but for its logistical and psychological failures, a case study in how bad planning can grind an army to dust. And in cultural memory, Antioch's miracle, the Holy Lance, became part of a larger narrative of faith as a rallying point, no matter the cost. The story was retold in later crusades, and even reimagined centuries later in folklore, mysticism, and Nazi propaganda. Even Peter Bartholomew, once a forgotten peasant, remains a symbol of the power of belief in desperate times, and of how thin the line is between inspiration and delusion. Final reflections. So what did Antioch leave behind? Not just a principality or a ruined wall, but a blueprint for both the promise and failure of organized human endeavor. It reminds us that great causes falter in the details, that unity often fractures under pressure, that wars, no matter how noble their origins, become tangled in the reality of disease, delay, and doubt. Above all, Antioch reveals a core truth of medieval history, one rarely taught in classrooms. That the world wasn't changed by the fastest swords or the brightest banners. It was shaped by the men who endured in silence, in filth, with cracked hands and empty stomachs, and sometimes by the ones who didn't make it at all. Story 5. Mail, Mud and Mutton. Daily life in a 13th century English manor. History tends to record what is sharp: battles, treaties, coronations. But what about the dull days? The long, wet centuries of tending sheep, mending roofs, and scraping barley into pottage. In the 13th century, much of England's population, well over 90%, lived nowhere near power. They didn't storm castles or pray in cathedrals. Instead, they lived on manors, self-contained communities where everyday survival was the only crusade. And while the manor might sound like the home of a lord, and it was also a living machine with rules, routines, and quiet complexities. It was where mail armor clanked past pigsties, where mutton stew simmered beside mud huts, and where the year was measured not in months but in harvests, saints, days, and taxes. This story isn't about a famous person. It's about the people who made up most of the medieval world, the ones too boring to be remembered, but without whom history wouldn't have happened at all. A manor is not a castle. Let's get something straight. A manor wasn't a fortress. It might have a wooden manor house or a stone one if the lord was wealthy, but it wasn't built to withstand sieges. The manor was a working estate, the engine of local economics and the nucleus of rural life. Think of it as part farm, part village, part bureaucracy. A typical English manor in the 13th century might include the manor house, where the lord or his appointed steward lived. The domain, pronounced domain, land reserved for the lord's use. Peasant holdings, often in narrow strips shared across different fields. A mill, usually water-powered, for grinding grain. A church, sometimes part of the manor, sometimes shared between manors. Common pasture, where animals grazed communally. And everywhere mud. Lots of it. Medieval England was wet. Roads were unpaved. Homes had thatch roofs and daub walls. Livestock wandered freely. And in winter, everything slowed except the cold. The lord and the ledger. The lord of the manor might be a nobleman, knight, bishop, or even a monastery. Some were absentee owners, living elsewhere and relying on stewards to manage the estate. His role wasn't to protect the people, but to extract value from the land. That meant collecting rent in money or kind from tenants, requiring labor services from peasants like plowing or harvesting on the domain, holding manorial court to resolve disputes and enforce obligations, ensuring that mills, bake ovens, and breweries, often monopolies, produced income. But it wasn't all top-down oppression. A manor only worked if it was stable. If the people left or died, the lord lost everything. Thus, the system was self-reinforcing. Peasants stayed, paid, and worked, in exchange for land, shelter, and a sliver of security. The peasants, freemen, villeins, and serfs. Not all peasants were equal. Freemen paid rent and owed no labor. Villeins held land in exchange for working the lord's domain, a set number of days per week. Cotters or bordars had smaller plots and often worked as laborers. And serfs, though increasingly rare, were legally bound to the land they couldn't leave without permission. Labor obligations were strict and detailed. A villein might owe 2-3 days per week of labor on the domain in ordinary seasons. Additional days during harvest or plowing seasons, called boon work. Extra dues like a heriot, a payment when a family member died, or tallage, a form of taxation. In return, peasants received strips of arable land, rarely consolidated, access to pastures, and the ability to sustain themselves barely. The daily grind, literally. A typical day on a 13th century English manor started at dawn. There were no clocks. Time was measured by the sun, the church bell, and the tasks at hand. In summer, the workday might begin around 4:30 a.m. and end at dusk. In winter, light dictated labor, shorter days, but bitter cold and frozen earth. Tasks varied by season. Spring, plowing fields with teams of oxen, guided by a wooden plow called an ard. Spreading manure collected all winter. Mending fences and digging drainage ditches. Summer, weeding, haymaking, sheep shearing, a major community event. Autumn harvest, reaping barley, oats, wheat, and rye, often with primitive sickles. Gathering vegetables, leeks, onions, turnips. Storing grain in barns and tithing 1/10 to the church. Winter, tending livestock, spinning wool, brewing ale and repairing tools. Butchering pigs before the cold preserved the meat. The most critical element, the mill. Peasants were usually required to use the Lord's mill to grind grain and pay for the privilege. Some tried to build hand mills or querns in secret, but if caught, the penalty was severe. Grinding your own grain was seen as stealing from the Lord. Meals, pottage. Forget the feasts of King Arthur. For most people, pottage was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was a stew of barley or oats, leeks and onions, occasionally beans or lentils, and if you were lucky, a scrap of bacon or fish. Bread was coarse, dark, and dense. Ale was the main drink, not because people preferred it, but because water could be unsafe. Ale was mildly alcoholic and brewed often, usually by women called alewives. Meat, only a few times per year, unless you poached game, which was illegal and punishable by death in royal forests. Milk, often reserved for children, or turned into cheese for preservation. Holidays and feast days, often tied to the church calendar, were the rare exceptions. During these times, more food was served, work was suspended, and the manor saw a kind of subdued joy. But on most days, eating was just another way of surviving. Mud and mail, where labor met the sword. The manor wasn't all peasants and pigs. There was also the knight if the lord was a land-holding soldier. Though rarely present full-time, the knight brought with him a different world, chivalry, war, and armor. His mail shirt, called a hauberk, might hang in the hall, rusting in the damp. His war horse, if he owned one, would require enormous upkeep. He trained with spear and sword, but his true value was as a vassal, obligated to fight for his liege. Still, when not at war, knights often spent time on their manors overseeing justice, collecting revenues, and reminding peasants politely or otherwise who was in charge. Their presence brought a curious juxtaposition, refined violence in the middle of mud. On the same estate, you might see a man in chainmail ride past a woman scattering chicken feed beside a collapsing hovel. That was the manor, worlds stacked atop one another, bound by land, necessity, and a shared indifference to glamour. The quiet center of a loud century. The 13th century in England saw major events. The reign of Henry III, the rebellion of Simon de Montfort, the Magna Carta's reinforcement, the growth of Parliament. But in the manors, life didn't shift much. Rain still came, crops still failed, children were born and died, and every year taxes were due both to the Lord and to God. Records like the Doomsday Book, though from an earlier period, show that manors were incredibly well documented. By the 13th century, this paperwork had grown: rent rolls, harvest accounts, labor lists. The medieval bureaucracy of the manor became one of the most stable institutions in pre-modern Europe. Because if you wanted to build a kingdom, you needed grain. And if you wanted grain, you needed a muddy little manor with its oxen, its pottage, and its people who endured. But here's the question. If life on the manor was so hard, why did most people stay? Was it loyalty, or simply the absence of anywhere else to go? If Section 1 of our journey into manor life painted a picture of the structures and social roles, Section 2 is about the rhythm of it all, the slow, seasonal churn of rural life that determined who worked, who fasted, who married, and who paid. For the medieval peasant, time did not flow through days or hours. It flowed through seasons, feasts, harvests, and obligations. These cycles weren't measured with clocks or calendars, but with more immediate realities. When the frost comes, after the hay is in, before St. Martin's Day. This section takes you through the yearly calendar of a 13th century English manor, focusing on the intersections of agriculture, religion, community, and survival. Because on the manor, life wasn't defined by who you were, but by what you could get done before the weather changed. The year begins in March. In the medieval world, the new year didn't start in January. On many manors, the functional calendar began in March, as the earth thawed and plowing began. This was the start of the agricultural year, and it dictated everything. March-April was the plowing season. Oxen, hitched in slow-moving pairs, pulled primitive wooden plows over sodden fields. Peasants used open-field systems, where the land was divided into long, narrow strips, shared among families. It was backbreaking work. Fields had to be manured, often with human waste or livestock dung. Ditches needed clearing. Fallow plots had to be rotated according to the three-field system, one for autumn grains, wheat, rye, one for spring grains, barley, oats, and one left fallow. Missing this window meant disaster. If crops weren't sown on time, the manor risked famine. Summer, when the days are long but never long enough. Summer was a period of constant labor. Days could begin as early as 4:00 a.m. and go until sundown. Tasks included weeding fields, an essential but thankless task. Haymaking in early summer. Hay had to be cut, dried, and stacked for winter fodder. Shearing sheep, a communal effort, often with singing, stories, and sore backs. Maintaining tools, carts, and fences. Summer was also when the manorial court was most active. Disputes about boundaries, debts, or minor crimes were heard by the steward or lord's representative. Punishments ranged from fines to stocks, and occasionally public shamming for offenses like brewing weak ale or not attending church. But the main concern in summer wasn't justice, it was getting ready for harvest. Autumn, the moment everything counts. Harvest season was the most important time of year. Every able-bodied men, women, children worked to bring in the crops. This was often done under the eye of the reeve, a peasant elected yearly to enforce the lord's interests and organize labor. Key autumn tasks: reaping grain with sickles, often starting at dawn. Thrashing, beating the harvested grain to separate kernels from husks. Winnowing, tossing grain into the air so wind could blow away the chaff. This was also when tithes were due, 10% of your produce, usually taken to the local church. Sometimes this was literal bundles of wheat, other times symbolic, measured in coin or animals. And then there were boon works, extra days of unpaid labor owed to the Lord during peak periods. Refusing them wasn't an option, it was an obligation tied to your land rights. Once the grain was stored, and hopefully dry enough to avoid spoilage, the manor turned its attention to preparing for winter. Winter, stillness, sickness, and superstition. Winter on the manor was deceptively quiet. Fields lay dormant, travel slowed or stopped, but behind the silence were critical tasks. Repairing tools, spinning wool, weaving cloth, and making candles. Slaughtering livestock, especially pigs, whose meat was salted or smoked. Brewing ale, a vital calorie source during cold months. And crucially, coping with illness. Without fresh food, vitamin deficiencies were common, especially scurvy, which caused bleeding gums, fatigue, and death. Homes were unheated, save for smoky hearths, and dampness brought on fevers, infections, and joint pain. Superstition increased in winter's darkness. People believed that evil spirits, witches, and unquiet souls were more active when nights were long. Charms were hung, crosses carved, saints' relics were invoked for protection. But above all, winter was a time to wait, to survive, and to hope that spring would come again. The church and the calendar. The church provided more than faith, it structured the entire year. Every month was dotted with holy days, from saints' feasts to major festivals like Candlemas Feb 2, the symbolic end of winter. Easter, celebrated with special food, church services, and occasionally new clothes. Lammas Aug 1, the festival of the first wheat harvest. Michaelmas Sept 29, the traditional end of the harvest. Christmas, celebrated with rest, ale, and a break from field work. On Sundays, work was generally forbidden, though this rule was often ignored during planting or harvest emergencies. The church also regulated fasting periods like Lent, during which meat, dairy, and sometimes eggs were prohibited. This was partly spiritual but also practical. It stretched food supplies until the next harvest. For peasants, the church was the one stable institution in their lives. It baptized them, married them, and buried them. Its bells marked time, its festivals marked years, and its taxes marked poverty. Community, the peasant network. Despite hardship, the manor was not a lonely place. Villagers shared ovens, pastures, and wells. Gossiped during thrashing, sang during spinning, and told stories around fires. Supported one another through illness, childbirth, and old age because no one else would. Children were raised communally, marriages arranged locally, and old people, when no longer able to work, relied on kin and charity to survive. It was a hard life, but it was a shared life. That made it bearable. When the system broke, not all years were stable. Bad weather ruined crops. Animal plagues killed livestock. Overlords raised rents, or new lords took over and demanded different terms. During these times, hunger turned to revolt. Not in open rebellion, not yet, but in quiet resistance. Missed labor days, underreported yields, secret foraging, or illegal grain storage. In rare cases, entire manors were abandoned. Families fled to towns or other estates. Lords responded by punishing families, placing villages under interdict, or petitioning higher nobles for enforcement. And when things truly collapsed, such as during the Great Famine, 1315–1317, or the Black Death, 1348, manors all over England emptied, and the whole system began to unravel. But in the 13th century, those crises had not yet arrived. The manor still worked barely. Because most years, people got just enough food to see spring again. And sometimes that was enough. So here's the question. Was the manor a trap, or was it the only place in the world that made any sense? And did peasants cling to it out of loyalty, or because leaving meant stepping into something worse? The manor, for all its routines and rituals, was never meant to last forever. By the time the 13th century came to a close, subtle changes were already rippling through rural England. Economic pressures, social shifts, and natural disasters began to unravel the old order. And while the manor system didn't fall overnight, it started to fray. Quietly, unevenly, like a worn rope just beginning to split at its edges. In this final section, we explore how the manor, the stable, muddy world that had defined life for so many, began to change. The transformation wasn't sparked by revolution or invention, but by famine, plague, and the growing awareness that the world beyond the fields was changing faster than anyone in the village could quite understand. This isn't a dramatic ending, it's a long exhale. The manor didn't burn down, it drifted away. A system built on fragile equilibrium. The medieval manor depended on balance. Between land and labor, too little of either and productivity collapsed. Between lord and peasant too, much pressure and resistance grew. Between season and harvest, a single bad year could ruin a decade. For much of the 13th century, that balance held. But toward the end of the century, small disruptions began to tip the scales. Population growth outpaced food production. Poor harvests in the 1270s and 1280s led to localized famine. Lords began to enclose common lands, shrinking peasant access to grazing and foraging. And then came a catastrophe that the manor system was not built to survive. The Great Famine, 1315–1317, hunger without blame. Though outside the 13th century proper, the Great Famine looms so large over the manor system that we must look ahead to understand the cracks already forming. Beginning in 1315, relentless rain destroyed crops across northern Europe. Grain rotted in the fields, roads became impassable, livestock drowned in pastures or died of disease. Salt, used to preserve meat and fish, became scarce. People starved. Manorial records from the time are sparse but telling. Yields drop sharply, mortality rises, rents go unpaid, laborers vanish from rolls. And unlike war or invasion, there was no one to blame, no enemy to fight, just the sky and the silence that followed. The famine didn't end the manor system, but it hollowed it out. The margins of survival became thinner, trust in the old rhythms weakened, and in that weakness, new ideas crept in. The rise of the market economy. The 13th century saw the beginnings of a monetized rural economy. More peasants paid cash rents instead of labor services. Some manors began leasing land rather than demanding feudal obligations. Surplus grain and wool were sold in local markets, not just consumed. Towns grew, offering wages for work that weren't tied to soil or seasons. In short, choice entered the system. A peasant could sell eggs, hire a plowman, buy iron tools, or move to town. Slowly, manorial isolation gave way to flexibility. This wasn't liberation, it was negotiation. But for the first time, some peasants had options. The peasant as a legal person. A striking development in the late 13th and early 14th centuries was the evolution of legal literacy among peasants. Manor courts had always recorded disputes, deaths, and inheritances, but over time more peasants understood their rights, learned how to challenge lords over unfair dues, used the law to protect inheritance, defend land claims, or seek redress. This wasn't rebellion, it was bureaucracy as resistance. Quiet, tedious, slow, and often successful. Records show peasants suing lords or stewards and winning. Some freed themselves from villainage by purchasing their liberty. Others formed community associations to support widows, aid the sick, and negotiate collective duties. It was, in its own dull way, a kind of revolution through paperwork. The manor's decline, not death. By 1300, the manor had already changed. Lords increasingly became absentee landlords, investing in trade or royal service. Stewards ran estates using ledgers, not loyalty. Labor dues were often commuted to cash. Some manors fell into debt or fragmented into smaller holdings. And yet, for many places, the manor persisted not as a feudal fortress, but as a rural neighborhood. In some parts of England, the manorial court continued into the 18th century, reduced to handling land transfers, boundary disputes, and drainage problems. The idea of the manor never fully disappeared. It was absorbed into parish life, county law, and eventually estate management. But its soul, the closed world of interdependent labor and seasonal rhythm, was already fading. What stayed the same? Despite the transformations, some things remained deeply familiar. Pottage was still the staple food for centuries. Wool and grain still defined the economy. weather still dictated survival. And most people, until well into the early modern period, still lived by the land, on land, or near landowners. The manor as an institution may have waned, but its cultural legacy endured. Even today, we retain fragments. The word manor lives on in real estate and fiction. Concepts like tenancy, common land, and hereditary rights trace back to medieval landholding. The English countryside, with its hedgerows and fields, still echoes the layout of manorial systems. In the most basic sense, the manor built the landscape of rural England. The peasant's quiet legacy. History rarely remembers the names of the peasants who tilled, threshed, and trudged their way through the 13th century. No chroniclers wrote their stories. No ballads celebrated their work. But their labor fed armies, funded castles, shaped language, law, and landscape. They were the backbone of a society that rarely acknowledged their bones. And in surviving through rain, war, famine, and bureaucracy, they left behind something more lasting than monuments: the uninterrupted continuity of life. Final reflections. We began this story in the mud, beside pigs and pottage pots. We watched as seasons turned labor into rhythm, and obligation into order. And now, at the edge of the manor's long shadow, we see that boring history holds deep meaning. The manor wasn't noble or glorious. It was not a story of greatness, but it was the mechanism by which millions survived. In every strip field and tithe barn, in every ox cart and hayrick, the story of human resilience was quietly written. And while the manor faded, the people who lived in its rhythm, they changed the world, not with revolts or inventions, but simply by refusing to stop working. Story 6, The Silent Census, Doomsday Book and the Power of Knowing Everything. In the year 1085, a chill settled over England, not from weather, though that year was unseasonably harsh, but from something more unsettling, a royal order to count everything and everyone. Villages buzzed with quiet questions. What is he planning? Is it for taxes? War? The king's clerks, pale, silent, meticulous, appeared like ghosts, scribbling, measuring, and asking questions. Then they left just as quickly. What followed was a book. No illustrations, no embellishment, just names, numbers, cows, plows, fields, and finds. The Doomsday Book, compiled in 1086, was the most ambitious administrative undertaking in Western Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. A snapshot of an entire country, frozen in ink. And after it was done, nothing. No great reforms, no speeches, no announcements, just silence. This is the story of how William the Conqueror, fresh from his bloody seizure of England, built a book not to be read, but to remind everyone that they could be watched. England before the book. Before the Normans arrived in 1066, England was a land of localized authority. Earls and thanes ruled over shires and hundreds. Taxes were collected sporadically. Landholding was often customary, not written. The system worked mostly because it was small, tribal, and deeply local. Then came William of Normandy. He won the crown at Hastings, but his real work began afterward, replacing the entire aristocracy, installing Norman barons, and extending feudal control over a suspicious, often rebellious, Anglo-Saxon population. By 1085, William had spent nearly 20 years putting out fires. But there was one more piece missing: control by information. To rule a kingdom, he needed to know who owned what, who used to own it, how much it was worth, and how much labor, livestock, and land he could demand from each village. Why now? The Doomsday Book was commissioned under ominous circumstances. In 1085, there were threats of invasion from Denmark. English resistance still simmered in the north, and William faced financial strain after years of war. He needed to know what he could tax, how many men he could raise, and who might challenge him. It was a preventative act of statecraft, born not from curiosity but from insecurity. A council at Gloucester in December 1085 made the decision. Within weeks, royal agents were dispatched across the realm. Their mission: record everything. The survey: cold, comprehensive, and unsettling. The questions asked by the Doomsday Commissioners were unnervingly specific. From the primary sources, we know they asked: who held the land in the time of King Edward, before 1066? Who holds it now? How many plows? How many villagers, bordars, slaves? How much woodland, meadow, and pasture? How many mills? How many fish ponds? How much was it worth in King Edward's day, and how much now? These were not estimates. Villagers were summoned under oath, often in groups of 12, a kind of proto-jury, to speak for the entire community. And they had to agree. If they didn't, the clerk kept digging. The commissioners wrote in Latin. The writing is terse, abbreviated, and brutally factual. No opinions, no commentary, just data. Even the layout of the final book suggests bureaucracy, not storytelling. The land is organized by county, and within each, by landholder, a reflection of the Norman feudal system, where power flowed not from the crown downward, but from the land upward. Doomsday, a judgment without appeal. The book was never officially named by William. The term Doomsday only appears decades later. It refers to Doomsday, the biblical judgment, the day when all will be accounted for. The name stuck because, like Judgment Day, this record left nothing out, allowed no changes, could not be appealed. If it said you owed a pig, you owed a pig. If it said your grandfather held 2 hides of land, then that was law. In a time without photography, maps, or census records, the Doomsday Book created a permanent truth, not necessarily an accurate one, but an unchallengeable one. What the book contained. The Doomsday Book survives in 2 volumes. Great Doomsday, covering most of England. Little Doomsday, covering Essex, Norfolk, and Suffolk in more detail. Some notable facts. It lists over 13,000 places. It records more than 250,000 people, mostly heads of households. It names around 1,000 tenants-in-chief, those who held land directly from the king. It documents over 6,000 watermills, suggesting a surprisingly industrial countryside. It provides population proxies through households, livestock, and plow teams. But what's most striking isn't the numbers, it's the absence of narrative. There is no context, no why, no how, just the ledger. And then silence. After 1086, the Doomsday Book was quietly placed in the royal treasury. It was not made public. It was not distributed to local lords. It was not followed by sweeping reforms or legal codification. It simply existed as an instrument of authority, a reminder that the king knew what you had and when you got it. In this sense, the Doomsday Book was less a tool for action and more a psychological weapon. Its very existence changed behavior. Would you build a mill without permission, knowing it would be recorded? Would you dispute a neighbor's land if the book listed them as the rightful holder? No need for soldiers. No need for laws, just a single, immutable document. The quiet power of bureaucracy. Modern readers might overlook the radical nature of the Doomsday Book. In a world of oral tradition, local custom, and vague memory, it was an act of violent clarity. It froze ownership. It codified inequality. It replaced community memory with state memory. And it taught England an enduring lesson. That control doesn't always come from swords. Sometimes it comes from ink. The book turned land into data, people into entries, and villages into columns of value. Even today, legal disputes occasionally cite Doomsday entries, to settle questions of ancient rights or land boundaries. The book, meant for short-term security, became a permanent foundation. Final thought. The Doomsday Book remains one of the most quietly influential artifacts in European history. Not because of its content, but because of what it proved, that knowledge could rule. That a king who knew what you had didn't need to take it not yet. That surveillance didn't require spies, just scribes. And so the villagers, the peasants, the lords, and the reeves kept working. They paid what the book said they owed. They lived within lines they had not drawn. Because the king had written it down. And once written down, it was law. So here's the question. Why build a book like this, if not to use it? Was William preparing for something, or simply proving that he could see everything? By now, you understand what the Doomsday Book was. A kingdom-wide survey of land, people, and property ordered by William the Conqueror in 1085-86. It was a remarkable act of royal oversight, a static snapshot of England's wealth, ownership, and obligations. But what did the Doomsday Book really reveal? This section will take you inside the pages where fields were counted, fish ponds noted, and the stories of England's social transformation lay hidden in plain, bureaucratic lines. Because while it's tempting to see Doomsday as a cold ledger, it's far more than that. It's a map of conquest, a record of displacement, and an instrument of power wrapped in parchment and silence. Beneath its data lies a narrative of winners, losers, survivors, and those caught in the slow machinery of feudal change. Let's now open the book not just to read it, but to understand it. A record of conquest in disguise. At first glance, Doomsday appears impartial. It lists facts, it uses numbers, it gives everyone an entry. But if you look more closely, you start to notice what's missing and what has changed. Before 1066, the Anglo-Saxon elite controlled nearly all English land. Thanes, earls, and bishops held it under King Edward the Confessor. Their holdings were defined by tradition and maintained through kinship networks. By 1086, almost the entire upper class had been replaced. Over 90% of land recorded in the Doomsday Book was in the hands of Normans or continental lords. These included William's half-brothers, Odo of Bayeux and Robert of Mortain, loyal knights and barons, many of whom had never seen England before 1066, Norman abbeys and bishoprics, which had been given land as royal rewards. In this way, Doomsday didn't just record the land, it justified its seizure. It wrote the new elite into history, as though they had always been there. Doomsday offered no commentary, no judgment. It simply erased the past by writing a new present. From thanes to tenants, the landholding structure captured by Doomsday shows a massive shift from customary ownership to feudal tenure. Under the Anglo-Saxon system, land was often inherited or held by local agreement. It belonged to a person, and that person answered to the king through public obligations like military service or taxation. Under the Norman system, all land technically belonged to the king. Everyone else held it from someone above them, in a descending pyramid. The king at the top, then tenants and chief lords, who held land directly from the king. Then subtenants, knights or steward, who held land from those lords. Finally, the peasants, who actually worked the land. Doomsday reflects this hierarchy with precision. A typical entry might say, Robert holds from Earl Hugh. Ulrich held it before 1066. It is worth 40 shillings. In this one sentence, a world changes. Robert, a Norman, now owns what Ulrich, an Anglo-Saxon, once held. That ownership is conditional. He holds it from Earl Hugh, another Norman. The value is fixed and recorded, taxable, and no longer subject to local dispute. Land was no longer something you had, it was something you owed. Peasants on paper. Doomsday is often silent about individuals of lower rank, but it reveals plenty through patterns and terminology. People are not named except occasionally, if they were freemen, but they are counted, ranked, and classified. Typical categories include villani, roughly translated as villains or tenant farmers; bordars, smallholders with less land, often with obligations; slaves, unfree laborers, some of whom lived in the lord's household; cotters, cottagers, who had a house and small garden but little or no arable land; freemen, sokemen, landholders with greater independence, common in areas like East Anglia. In many places, slavery had already begun to decline. William's own household was said to have forbidden the sale of slaves abroad, and over the following century, slavery in England slowly disappeared. Still, Doomsday offers a window into social stratification. A manor might have 3 villagers, 2 bordars, 1 slave, 2 freemen, and 4 plough teams. This told the crown and future readers who produced, who paid, and who counted. But the vast majority of the population went unnamed. They lived, they worked, they died. Doomsday preserved their labor, but not their lives. The machinery of manor and value. At its heart, Doomsday is a record of manors, the basic economic units of Norman England. Each manor had a lord tenant-in-chief or subtenant, a group of peasants or workers, resources, land for crops, pasture, woods, water, mills, fisheries, a value assessed in pounds, shillings, and pence. That value mattered. It told the king how much tax to expect, but it also told the owner what kind of status the land conferred. A manor worth 10 pounds was a different kind of power than one worth 40 shillings. Interestingly, many entries list 3 values. In King Edward's time, before 1066, when the Norman lord took over, at the time of the survey, this allowed the crown to trace decline or growth. In some cases, land lost value due to war, rebellion, or destruction. The infamous harrying of the North, where William devastated vast areas to suppress revolt, left entire regions marked. It is waste. That was all it said. Secrets, lies, and strategic reporting. For all its detail, Doomsday was not immune to manipulation. Lords and communities had incentives to underreport. If you owned less, you might owe less tax. If you claimed your land was worthless, you might avoid obligations. If you said it was waste, you might buy time to recover without interference. Yet the commissioners had tools to push back. By cross-referencing testimonies from multiple villages and requiring oaths from jurors, they created redundancy in the data. Still, some regions, particularly in the north, remained underreported, and certain areas like London, Winchester, and parts of the northwest were not included at all. Even in surveillance, there were blind spots. Who benefited? Doomsday served many masters, but chief among them was the king. William used it to secure tax revenue, legitimize Norman land claims, resolve property disputes, project authority across regions he rarely visited. But it also benefited some lords, who could use it to assert dominance, settle inheritance disputes, and enforce labor obligations. Peasants, meanwhile, had little say in the process. Their work was documented, taxed, and managed, but rarely acknowledged. Still, in a strange way, Doomsday preserved them. Without it, many of their villages and occupations would be lost to time. It is, for all its coldness, a form of historical immortality. The book that froze time. Perhaps the strangest thing about the Doomsday Book is how it froze a moving world. It captured a rapidly changing society, a post-conquest land in flux, a nation shifting from Anglo-Saxon customs to Norman rule. But once written down, that snapshot became law. Landowners would reference it for centuries. Disputes were settled by citing it. Claims were judged not by memory or witness, but by what the book said. It was the final word, even if it was wrong. Final thought. Doomsday wasn't just a survey. It was an act of redefinition. It turned people into tenants. It turned land into tax. It turned stories into numbers. And most of all, it turned memory into parchment. The pen, in Doomsday's case, wasn't mightier than the sword it simply cleaned up after it. But here's the question. If Doomsday was so important, why was it never done again? Did the very power of the book make it unrepeatable? By now, we've traveled deep into the quiet power of the Doomsday Book, what it recorded, how it changed England, and how it silenced a century of upheaval with the cold finality of ink. In this final section, we'll look at what came after. What became of the book that captured England so completely? Why was it never updated or repeated in full? How did a seemingly dull administrative document become one of the most important sources in the history of Western Europe? The Doomsday Book wasn't just a one-time event. Its afterlife is long and strange. It endured as law, as legend, and eventually as national myth. This section explores the unfolding consequences of writing everything down. Because once you turn a country into a book, you've changed it forever. Why it was never done again. The most obvious question is also the hardest to answer. Why wasn't there a second Doomsday Book? Kings came and went. Taxes continued. Surveys were conducted again, but never on the same scale or with the same totality. Why? Several reasons. The costs were enormous. The Doomsday Survey took hundreds of scribes, messengers, clerks, and courts. It drew on the labor of thousands of villagers who testified under oath. Once done, the Crown may have realized, the effort didn't match the ongoing need. They had their snapshot. Updating it regularly would be impossible with medieval infrastructure. Its power was in its finality. Doomsday froze property claims. A second book could open them again. To update it would mean questioning the first one. That risked undermining its authority, and by extension, the authority of the monarchy. It was never meant to be a living document. Unlike a ledger or register, Doomsday was declarative, not dynamic. It settled things, like a judgment from on high. Administrative shifts took over. Over time, the English state developed more regular tax rolls, like the pipe rolls, legal records and rental surveys, like the 100 rolls of 1279. These systems were more suited to ongoing governance, whereas Doomsday had been created for consolidation after conquest. So while its form was never copied, its logic that knowledge is power echoed across centuries. Legal afterlives. Throughout the Middle Ages and well into the modern era, the Doomsday Book retained legal weight. It was cited in land disputes between noble families, boundary disagreements between parishes, cases of ancient rights like hunting, milling, or holding markets. Judges treated it as primary evidence. If Doomsday said a manor existed in 1086 and your ancestor held it, that could validate modern claims. Even King Henry II in the 12th century used Doomsday to confirm or deny royal rights over forests and taxes. The book became, in essence, a portable memory of royal authority. Kings changed, courts changed, but Doomsday didn't. And because it didn't change, it became more authoritative the older it got. An unexpected cultural icon. Despite its dry content, the Doomsday Book developed a mythic status in English history. In the 17th century, antiquarians pored over it as a key to the Norman past. By the 19th century, it was seen as part of England's constitutional tradition, symbolizing the power and limits of royal government. In the 20th century, it was treated almost as a national treasure, a symbol of administrative genius and continuity. When Queen Elizabeth II was crowned in 1953, Doomsday was placed alongside the coronation regalia, not because it was beautiful or sacred, but because it represented the foundations of the modern state. The 1986 Second Doomsday, a modern echo. To mark the 900th anniversary of the original, the UK launched the Doomsday Project in 1986. It invited people across the country to record details about their communities, population, schools, local customs, landscape and climate, thoughts on the future. Over 1 million contributors submitted entries, creating a vast digital snapshot of England. But the technology used early laserdiscs became obsolete quickly. For years, the new Doomsday was unreadable. In a strange echo of the original, this modern version was preserved but mostly inaccessible. Only later was it rescued by digital archivists. The lesson: even in the digital age, capturing a moment forever is harder than it looks. Reading between the lines. When we read the Doomsday Book today, we're reading backwards. We know how England developed. The rise of Parliament, the decline of feudalism, the Industrial Revolution, empire. But in 1086, none of that was certain. What Doomsday reveals is the moment before the moment, a kingdom that has just changed hands, whose population is mostly illiterate, whose fields are worked by people with no say in governance, and whose monarch is trying to secure power not through terror, but through tallying. It's a moment of anxiety, and yet it's also a moment of remarkable administrative ambition. How many medieval societies tried to count every pig, every acre of woodland, every man who held a plow. It may be dull, it may be dry, but it was unprecedented. The myth of objectivity. There's a temptation to treat the Doomsday Book as objective truth. But like any record, it was shaped by power, fear, flawed memory, and human error. Lords may have inflated their holdings. Villagers may have undercounted livestock. Clerks may have mistranscribed figures. Regional customs may have warped terminology. In some entries, values appear suspiciously low, perhaps to avoid taxation. In others, waste, land is listed that we know from other sources was productive. So we must remember, Doomsday was not the truth. It was what the king wanted to know, recorded by men who feared him, from sources who did not trust one another. Still, it's what we have. And that makes it, paradoxically, one of the most important lies in history. The power of knowing and being known. What does Doomsday ultimately tell us? It tells us that control does not always begin with conquest. Sometimes it begins with questions. Who owns this land? What did it used to be worth? Who plows it now? What is the name of the man who mills the grain? And once the questions are asked, once the answers are written down, the world changes. People act differently. Systems harden. Memory fades. Doomsday gave England a state, even before it had a nation. Final reflection. The Doomsday Book is a triumph of quiet history. It's not about battles, kings, or glory. It's about who had 5 pigs, who lost their land, which village had a fish pond, and what it was worth before the Normans came. It's boring, yes, but it's boring in a way that shaped a country. And in a world where power often hides behind spectacle, Doomsday reminds us that sometimes the most lasting control is recorded in silence. Story 7, not just a monk's job. Scribes, scripts, and the medieval copy machine. If you've ever been frustrated by a slow printer, try imagining this. You need a copy of a 300-page book, and it will take you 6 months to make it, one letter at a time, using a goose feather, ink made from oak galls, and your own 2 hands. And when you're finished, your copy will have errors. This was the reality of preprint Europe, a world where every single book, document, or letter had to be created manually, usually by people trained not only in writing but also in copying with precision. Before the printing press, the written word was precious because it was so hard to reproduce. In this story, we'll explore the long-forgotten history of the medieval scribes, the quiet, often anonymous copyists who built the foundations of Western learning, one quill stroke at a time. This is a tale not of kings or conquests, but of the boring miracles of bureaucracy, perseverance, and parchment. It is the story of how the past was preserved not by warriors, but by writers. The monastic scriptoria, where silence wrote history. During much of the early medieval period, roughly the 6th to 12th centuries, the production of books was largely the domain of monasteries. Deep inside the stone walls of Benedictine or Cistercian abbeys, monks would gather in a designated space called the scriptorium, literally, a place for writing. It was not a lively place, quite the opposite. Silence was strictly enforced. Monks sat for hours hunched over desks, copying line by line, word by word. They worked by natural light when possible, no candles too close to vellum, lest it ignite. They dipped their quills into handmade ink, often ground from minerals or tree galls. The temperature had to be just right, cold enough to preserve the vellum, warm enough to keep fingers from stiffening. The goal was accuracy, but also reverence. Copying a religious text wasn't just writing, it was worship. What were they copying? The earliest medieval scribes focused primarily on religious texts. This included the Bible in full or in parts, commentaries by church fathers like Augustine or Jerome, rule books for monastic life, like the Rule of St. Benedict, hymns, liturgical guides, and calendars for feasts. But over time, scriptoria expanded their repertoire. They began copying ancient Roman and Greek texts, philosophy, rhetoric, logic, even medical treatises, local charters and land deeds, many of which survive because they were recopied in monastic centers. Early chronicles, preserving the histories of kings, saints, and weather. Without scribes, virtually all ancient literature would have vanished. A good example, we know of Cicero, Ovid, and Virgil not because their works survived undisturbed, but because generations of medieval copyists kept transcribing them, sometimes into styles of Latin they barely understood. The medium, parchment, quill, and ink. Writing required tools, and in the Middle Ages those tools were costly and painstaking to prepare. Parchment or vellum, made from animal skins, sheep, goat, or calf. Skins had to be soaked, scraped, stretched, dried, and cut. A single book could require dozens of animals. Quills, often made from goose or swan feathers. The nib had to be sharpened with a penknife, hence the name. Scribes kept multiple quills for different letters or purposes. Ink, usually made from oak galls caused by parasitic wasps, iron salts, and gum arabic. The result was a dark, durable ink still visible today. Other colors like red vermilion, blue azurite, or gold leaf were used for decoration. Ruling lines. Pages were ruled with a stylus or lead point to guide the script. Even small misalignment could cause entire pages to be redone. You didn't just write, you prepared, measured, and then wrote. The scribe's life, dull, dangerous, and holy. It's easy to romanticize scribes as quiet scholars, but the reality was more complex. Copying texts all day took a physical toll. Scribes often suffered from chronic hand cramps, back pain, and poor eyesight. Cold rooms meant stiff joints. Long hours of labor led to fatigue and mistakes. And yet this work was often seen as spiritually valuable. A 12th century scribe once wrote in a margin, "Writing bores me. I am cold. The light is bad. Let the reader remember that the work is laborious." And another, Thank God it will soon be dark. Still, for some monks, copying texts was a path to spiritual discipline. The copying of sacred words over and over was a kind of prayer in motion. Errors, corrections, and marginalia. Despite the seriousness of the work, errors were inevitable. A tired scribe might skip a line or repeat one. A rare word might be misread or miscopied. Multiple copies of a text could differ subtly, giving rise to textual variants that scholars still study. In some cases, glosses were added, explanations written in the margins or between lines. And occasionally, the margins tell more personal stories. Notes about the weather. Complaints about the quality of the parchment. Even jokes, riddles, or drawings, including rude ones. One famous margin note reads, "New parchment, bad ink, I say nothing more." In these notes, we hear the actual voices of people lost to time, the ghosts of boredom, quietly scratching their complaints into history. Scripts and styles. Scribes used a variety of scripts, each evolving over time and geography. Uncial, rounded, easy to read, used in early Christian texts. Carolingian minuscule, developed under Charlemagne, clear and uniform, the ancestor of modern lowercase letters. Gothic script, dense, angular, associated with high medieval texts. Insular script, a uniquely British-Irish style, used in works like the Book of Kells. Scripts mattered not just for legibility, but for prestige. Some manuscripts were copied for display in cathedrals or palaces. Others were purely functional. A scribe's handwriting could be high art or pure function, sometimes both. Beyond the monastery, secular scribes. By the 13th century, universities were rising, cities growing, and literacy expanding beyond the church. This led to the rise of professional scribes, not bound by monastic vows. Universities like Oxford and Paris had stationers, who managed libraries of master copies for duplication. Law courts and royal offices hired scribes to copy statutes, records, and decrees. Wealthy merchants and nobles began commissioning personal books. Still, the process remained manual. One person read aloud, several scribes wrote, errors multiplied, time passed. But slowly, writing was becoming a profession, not just a calling. Final thought. Before the printing press, the preservation of knowledge depended entirely on people willing to do the same thing, day after day, for years copying someone else's words so others could read them. It was not glamorous, it was not fast, it was not error-free. But without these scribes, monastic and secular, we would know almost nothing of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, or even the Bible. Their legacy isn't written in gold leaf or grand gestures. It's written in tired notes, smudged ink, and careful, boring accuracy. But here's the question. If scribes preserved the past, who decided what was worth copying and what was left to vanish forever? In the last section, we explored the physical world of the scribe, the desks, the parchment, the aching backs, the sacred silence of monastic scriptoria. But now we must turn to something more elusive and far more powerful. Joys. Because while scribes were the hands that copied, someone or something guided those hands. Not everything was written down, not every book was recopied, and not every idea survived. The medieval world was full of stories, texts, laws, poems, and philosophies that have been lost not because they were destroyed, but because they were never copied again. In this section, we'll explore what determined the survival of ideas in the preprint age. We'll look at the people who made these decisions, sometimes consciously, often passively, and the long shadows these choices cast over our understanding of the past. Who decides what's worth copying? The simple answer is the institutions who paid for it. In the early Middle Ages, this mostly meant monasteries, cathedral schools, royal courts. Later, with the rise of urban centers and universities, university stationers, private patrons, legal and bureaucratic offices. But behind these institutions were real people making real choices: abbots, scholars, bishops, bureaucrats. They decided which books were important enough to merit a fresh parchment and hours of labor. And once a text was no longer copied, it was effectively erased from the future. The Christian filter. In the early medieval period, the church was the gatekeeper of written knowledge in Western Europe. Texts were chosen for copying based on religious orthodoxy, moral clarity, usefulness to spiritual or liturgical life. This means that many ancient works did not survive. Plato and Aristotle fared reasonably well, especially in later centuries, but countless pagan texts were lost. Roman novels, nearly all vanished. Erotic poetry, discarded. Philosophical works deemed heretical, left to rot. Drama and satire, barely touched. For every Cicero that survived, dozens of lesser-known authors were lost. We only have 7 plays by Sophocles, but he wrote over 120. Some books were burned, but many more were simply not recopied, and so they faded away as old manuscripts crumbled. Accidental survivals. Some of what we know today exists because of chance. A single manuscript of Tacitus, Germania, survived in a monastery in Fulda. Works of Catullus were rediscovered in a single codex in Verona in the 14th century. Lucretius de Rerum Natura, a Roman atomic theory poem, was found in a German monastery in 1417 after being forgotten for centuries. The implication is unsettling. Much of what we know about ancient history comes from random survivals. If one monk had thrown a worm-eaten manuscript into the fire, entire philosophies might be gone. Practical texts and bureaucratic survival. While literature and philosophy faced selective copying, bureaucratic and legal documents had a different fate. Royal courts, church councils, and urban governments created and copied texts for practical use. Land grants, legal codes, tax records, guild charters, ecclesiastical decrees. These texts were often recopied not for ideological reasons, but because they were needed. Ironically, this means that some of the most detailed surviving records from the medieval period are utterly boring. Grain prices in Yorkshire, fishing rights in Brittany, court proceedings over pig theft. These mundane texts weren't preserved for beauty or wisdom, but because someone might want to check them again next week. Marginal lives, whose stories were left out. The vast majority of scribal labor focused on the affairs of elite men, kings, nobles, saints, bishops, scholars. Very few records were kept of peasant lives, women's voices, oral traditions, folk beliefs, everyday culture. This wasn't malicious omission. It was simply not seen as worth recording. As a result, much of medieval life is understood through inference, archaeology, or the occasional miracle of a preserved letter, diary, or marginal note. What we read today is a curated version of the past, one shaped by scribes copying for patrons who cared about law, faith, and order, not laughter, gossip, or feeling. Language and loss. Another factor in survival, language. Texts in Latin had the best chance of being preserved, because Latin remained the lingua franca of the church and scholarship for centuries. But texts in Old English, Old High German, Celtic languages, or vernacular French often fared worse. A famous example, Beowulf, the most important Old English poem, survives in only one manuscript, from around 1000 CE. If that single volume had burned, and it almost did in a fire in 1731, Beowulf would be unknown. So would the world it depicts of monster fights, heroic drinking, and fatal boasts. The same is true for early Irish sagas, Norse epics, and Germanic law codes. Many were written late or copied by scribes already working in Latin-centric environments. In this way, language choice determined cultural survival. The rise of universities and scholarly copying. From the 12th century onward, as universities emerged in Paris, Bologna, Oxford, and beyond, copying became more systematized. Universities used a system called piecea copying. A master copy was broken into sections, piecea. Scribes could rent a section to copy by hand. This sped up book production, relatively speaking. But again, the content was narrow. Theology, canon law, grammar and logic, basic philosophy. This meant certain works were endlessly copied, while others languished. Scholarly consensus became a filter. And as libraries grew, rare works were sometimes lost in the shuffle, forgotten in basements or misfiled. The invisible hand of cost. Copying was expensive. Producing a single book required dozens of animal skins, trained labor for months, binding, decoration, and illumination for higher-end books. Only the wealthy could afford it. This meant that copying priorities were often shaped not just by ideology, but by money. A wealthy bishop might commission a giant illuminated Bible. A university might fund copies of law texts, but no one was paying to copy old love poems unless they were rich and eccentric. And so, more law, less life. The unintended censorship of boredom. Finally, there's a quieter force, boredom. Some texts simply weren't interesting to copy. Too technical, too long, too repetitive, poorly written. Scribes, like anyone, had preferences. They might avoid texts that were dull, difficult, or disapproved of. Over time, this created a kind of accidental censorship, not of ideology, but of tedium. So when we read medieval manuscripts today, we're reading what someone else once thought was worth the trouble. And what they did. Gone. Final thought. The history of scribes is not just about the texts they copied. It's also about the gaps, the empty shelves, the pages never rewritten, the songs unsung. In a world where writing was precious, every book copied was a choice, and every choice shaped what we remember and what we forget. We like to imagine the past as vast and knowable, but in truth, it's a tiny keyhole view shaped by the hands that held the quill and the minds that told them what mattered. But here's the question. What happened when the copyists began to question the texts themselves, when scribes stopped just recording and started editing? In the first two sections, we met the scribes of the medieval world, quiet figures hunched in cold rooms, copying by hand the thoughts of saints, kings, and classical philosophers. We learned how their labor preserved entire civilizations and how their choices shaped what survived. But here's a truth we often forget. Copying is never entirely neutral. Scribes didn't just transcribe words. Sometimes they corrected, commented, rewrote, or silently altered what they copied. In this final section, we'll explore how scribes went from being passive vessels of knowledge to active editors of the past. We'll see how political, religious, and even personal motives slipped between the lines and how, through these small changes, scribes quietly shaped how history was remembered. Because even in the age before printing, the first drafts of history were already being edited. The myth of the perfect copy. We often picture scribes as painstaking and obedient, following the text word for word, line for line, never daring to stray. But the truth is messier. Errors were common, of course, dropped lines, repeated phrases, misread abbreviations. But scribes didn't just make mistakes. They also made decisions. Sometimes they corrected things they believed were wrong. Sometimes they added explanatory glosses, which were later absorbed into the main text. Sometimes they removed or replaced words that seemed heretical, outdated, or uncomfortable. And sometimes they did all this without any comment. So while the printed book promised exact duplication, the handwritten manuscript was always, in some sense, a reinterpretation. Political editing. Scribes worked in political worlds, especially in courts and monasteries supported by kings, dukes, or bishops. They were not immune to the pressure to clean up history. Take the example of Chronicle's medieval histories of kings, wars, and saints. Some scribes would omit details that cast their patrons in a bad light. Others would insert speeches, visions, or omens that never happened because they made a monarch seem divinely chosen. Dates could be changed to align certain events with religious festivals or eclipses. Even genealogies, the family trees of kings, were sometimes stretched or polished to establish divine right or noble lineage. In this way, the scribe wasn't just copying the past, he was massaging it into something useful. These weren't forgeries in the modern sense, they were acceptable editorial practices, shaped by loyalty and belief. Religious revisions. Religion added another layer of editorial pressure. In copying theological texts, scribes sometimes altered wording that bordered on heresy, passages misaligned with church doctrine, descriptions of miracles or saints that no longer fit current standards. For example, a scribe might change a line in a sermon to better reflect the teachings of Augustine, even if the original preacher said something slightly different. In hagiographies, lives of saints, scribes often enhanced miracles, smoothed contradictions, or added more virtuous deeds. Apocalyptic texts like commentaries on Revelation were regularly updated to align with current political fears. These edits were not seen as dishonest. They were often done in the spirit of clarifying or improving the text. But over time, they transformed the historical record. Personal voices in the margins. Not all changes were institutional, some were personal. Scribes often left traces of themselves in the margins, short notes, doodles, curses against pests, prayers for warmth. But occasionally they inserted their own thoughts into the text. A scribe might insert a personal reflection on suffering while copying a sermon about patience. A marginal note might challenge a claim made in the main text. Some scribes left annotations that reveal doubt, irony, or even sarcasm. These quiet moments offer rare glimpses into medieval interior life, not through literature, but through labor. One scribe famously added, "This book was written by a man who does not know the alphabet." Another, clearly exhausted, simply wrote, "Here ends the book, thanks be to God, and also to my aching hand." The problem of layered copies. Because manuscripts were recopied for centuries, many of the texts we have today are layered accumulations, each copy reflecting the choices, errors, and revisions of multiple scribes. Imagine a monk in the 9th century copies an old Roman medical text. A scribe in the 12th century copies his copy, correcting terms to reflect new medical theory. A humanist in the 15th century finds the manuscript and adds glosses comparing it to Greek sources. By the time we read it today, the original is buried under centuries of intervention. Philologists and historians often spend years reconstructing the original version of a text, comparing dozens of manuscript versions, tracing patterns of error, and trying to guess what a scribe might have changed or misunderstood. It's like peeling an onion backwards. The evolution of a story, King Arthur. One of the clearest examples of scribal invention is the Arthurian legend. The earliest references to Arthur, in Welsh and Latin texts, portray him as a rough military leader, more guerrilla than king. But over centuries of copying and embellishing, scribes and later, writers began to add a court, knights, a round table, the Grail, Lancelot, Guinevere, Merlin. Each of these editions appeared gradually in different copies. Some were added by French poets, others by English scribes. Some were borrowed from Celtic mythology, others invented outright. By the 14th century, Arthur had become a symbol of English chivalry entirely different from the historical figure, if he ever existed. And scribes were part of that evolution. They weren't just copying, they were building a myth, one line at a time. Resistance in ink. Occasionally, scribes used their position to push back against authority. In legal documents, some scribes inserted hidden complaints about the king or local lords. In religious texts, dissenting views were sometimes smuggled into glosses or alternate versions. Some female scribes left coded signatures, subtly asserting their authorship in a male-dominated world. One nun in the 12th century, identified by her unusual handwriting and use of certain pigments, is believed to have been a leading manuscript artist, a quiet act of rebellion against gender roles. These examples are rare, but they remind us that scribes were not just transmitters. They were interpreters, commentators, and sometimes subversives. When the press arrived, in the 15th century, Johannes Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press. Suddenly, books could be mass-produced. Errors could be standardized and mass-distributed. The role of the scribe began to vanish. At first, printed books imitated manuscripts. They included illuminations, decorated initials, even margins for glosses. But soon, the printed page imposed consistency, and with it, authority. The age of the scribe was ending. But the influence of centuries of scribal choices remained baked into the texts. And even today, when scholars edit ancient works, they must ask, which version is real, which changes are legitimate, and where did the scribe leave his mark? Final reflection. Scribes were not simply the hands of history, they were its editors, its curators, and sometimes its quiet challengers. Their work shaped what we remember and how we remember it. They remind us that even facts, once written down, can be bent by the hands that record them. So the next time you read an ancient text or admire a medieval manuscript, remember, behind every letter is a decision, behind every correction a choice, and behind every survival, a long chain of people who, for reasons practical, political, or personal, believed it was worth copying again. Story 8. The Wine That Sank the Empire, the Crisis of Roman Logistics. You might picture the Roman Empire in terms of emperors, armies, and aqueducts, and you wouldn't be wrong. But behind the imperial banners, marble columns, and Latin inscriptions was something far more mundane and far more essential. A logistics network. The Roman world was powered by movement of grain, of wine, of taxes, of troops, of messages. And keeping that movement steady was one of the empire's most exhausting and underappreciated achievements. This is not a story of conquest or collapse. It is the story of warehouses, ox carts, tax assessments, and the thousands of administrators who tried to keep the Roman world running. Because in the end, one of the things that weakened the mighty empire wasn't a barbarian horde or a bad emperor. It was a barrel of wine and the system that couldn't keep it moving. A civilization built on supply chains. Rome, at its height, governed over 60 million people across 3 continents. Its cities, especially Rome itself, were massive consumers of food, goods, and materials. To function, the empire had to constantly move. Grain from Egypt and North Africa. Wine from Gaul, Spain, and Italy. Olive oil from Hispania and Syria. Textiles and metals from every frontier. All of this had to travel hundreds or thousands of miles. And while Roman roads were famous, the real backbone of transport was the Mediterranean Sea. By ship, a ton of grain could be moved from Alexandria to Rome in weeks. By land, the same ton would take months and cost 10-20 times more. so Rome's economic logic depended on navigable rivers and seas, a seasonal understanding of weather and winds, a bureaucracy to manage flows, taxes, and deliveries. This was not a decentralized market. It was a heavily managed state machine, and it had to be because the margins for error were terrifyingly thin. The wine jug problem. Let's talk about wine. Wine was not a luxury. It was a daily staple, especially in cities. Romans drank wine as a basic beverage cut with water, mixed with herbs, even boiled. It was safer than water and cheaper than beer. A soldier, a slave, and a senator all drank it, though in very different vintages. But wine posed a problem. It had to be moved and stored, and its container of choice, the amphora, was fragile, heavy, and unwieldy. Amphorae were clay jars, usually holding 20-25 liters. They had to be sealed with pitch, wax, or resin to keep the wine stable. They were heavy and often broke in transport. Once emptied, they were usually discarded, creating mountains of ceramic waste, like the famous Monte Testaccio in Rome. Worse still, they couldn't be reused for other things like oil or grain. Amphorae were, in many ways, the ancient world's single-use packaging crisis. The empire could grow the wine, it could tax the wine, it could consume the wine. But moving it, that was a different challenge. How the Romans tried to fix it. The Romans were nothing if not practical, so they began experimenting with alternative containers. Barrels, a Gallic invention, wooden barrels were more durable and easier to stack. But Roman winemakers were slow to adopt them, preferring the traditional amphorae. Dolium, large clay vats sunk into the ground, good for storage, not great for transport. Leather skins, used by nomadic traders but unsuited for long-term storage due to spoilage. The real solution Rome leaned on was scale. Instead of changing how they moved wine, they increased how much they moved, and created entire bureaucracies to track, tax, and direct it. This required registrars to monitor vineyard output, customs agents at ports, tax collectors to assess wine in transit, publicans, private contractors, to oversee shipping. Wine became not just a product, but a logistical puzzle, one that touched every part of the empire's infrastructure. Grain and the urban problem. Wine was one thing, grain was another entirely. Rome itself needed over 150,000 tons of grain per year just to feed its citizens. Most of it came from Egypt via Alexandria, North Africa, modern Tunisia, Libya, Sicily. Grain shipments arrived at Ostia, Rome's port, and were transported upriver via flat-bottomed boats to the city. But this system was vulnerable. Winds could delay ships. Silt could clog harbors. Pirates, yes, even in the imperial age, could disrupt routes. Bureaucratic miscounts could cause shortages. To mitigate disaster, emperors stockpiled grain and provided subsidized bread rations to the poor, known as the annona. This worked until it didn't. Bottlenecks and bureaucracy. The Roman logistical system became increasingly complex over time. Emperors appointed prefects of the grain supply, praefectus annoni, who coordinated with local governors, ship captains, port officials, warehouse managers, horire. Taxes were sometimes paid in kind, in grain or wine, rather than in coin. These goods were then stored or redistributed to army bases, frontier forts, or urban markets. But the system relied on several fragile assumptions: stable harvests, reliable labor, non-corrupt officials, predictable shipping seasons. As the empire stretched further, these assumptions weakened. Civil wars interrupted trade routes. Local officials hoarded supplies. Bad weather ruined harvests. Inflation and coinage debasement made tax collection harder. and every disruption caused cascading shortages. When logistics fail, the 3rd century crisis. In the 3rd century CE, Rome entered a period of profound instability known today as the crisis of the 3rd century. Dozens of emperors rose and fell in rapid succession. Plagues reduced the workforce. Inflation skyrocketed. Barbarian invasions disrupted trade. The empire began fragmenting, and its logistical network, once the envy of the world, started to break down. Grain shipments from Egypt became irregular. Trade routes in Gaul and Hispania became dangerous. Cities shrank as food supplies dried up. Even wine, once abundant, became harder to transport safely. Rome itself was increasingly fed by local sources, not distant provinces. The days of global coordination were ending, and the entire imperial model based on moving food, goods, and taxes across thousands of miles was cracking under its own weight. Final reflection. It wasn't just swords and speeches that built Rome, it was ledgers. It was dock workers, grain counters, and warehouse clerks. And when those systems began to falter, not suddenly, but inch by inch, the empire began to starve, dry up, and slow down. Logistics is boring, but boring is what makes things work. In Rome's case, the slow failure of systems like wine transport and grain redistribution meant cities couldn't feed themselves, armies couldn't march, and taxes couldn't be paid. And all the marble in the world can't feed a hungry city. But here's the question. How did ordinary Romans, farmers, traders, dockhands adapt when the imperial system they relied on began to collapse? In the first section, we looked at how the Roman Empire's complex logistical system was the invisible machinery behind its greatness, moving wine, grain, oil, and taxes across vast distances. But we also saw how fragile that system became over time. Rome's greatness depended not just on conquest or culture, but on coordination. And when that coordination began to falter, life didn't just stop. People adapted. This section is not about emperors or armies. It's about bakers, farmers, millers, merchants, and minor officials, the people who lived through the slow-motion collapse of a supply chain that once fed a continent. Because as the empire's roads crumbled, its taxes inflated, and its ships stopped coming to port, ordinary people did what they've always done in times of crisis. They found workarounds, they bent the rules. They returned to old methods or invented new ones. And slowly, they built a different world, one less global, more local, and in some ways more sustainable. The localizing of empire. One of the biggest consequences of imperial logistics breaking down was the localization of production. Cities that once depended on imported grain began to rely on nearby farms. Wine that once came from distant provinces was now made and consumed locally. Regional economies that once specialized began to diversify, not to grow, but to survive. Rome itself, once the hub of a continental food network, saw its population shrink from over 1 million to just tens of thousands by the 5th century. The great grain fleets no longer docked at Ostia. Public bread rations vanished. The vast storage warehouses, Horia, were abandoned or repurposed. Without the empire's logistics, Rome became a provincial city again. And across the empire, people began turning inward. This wasn't a collapse in the cinematic sense, it was more like a slow unraveling, where systems broke down in stages and people shifted their expectations. The return of the villa economy. In the early imperial period, many rural elites lived in villas, large countryside estates that grew olives, grapes, or grain for export to cities and the army. As the empire declined, these villas changed. They became more self-sufficient, producing for local use rather than export. Landowners took on greater judicial and administrative powers in their regions. Labor shifted from wage work to dependence or obligation, as peasants sought protection. This was not yet the full medieval feudal system, but it was the beginning. In Gaul, Spain, and Italy, powerful landowners became miniature governors, filling the vacuum left by imperial retreat. They built private granaries, local militias, and community churches. In doing so, they created new logistical networks, but on a smaller scale. What once took fleets and bureaucrats now happened between landlords and dependents, abbots and villagers. Peasant adaptation, flexibility and fragmentation. Peasants, the majority of the population, were often portrayed by Roman elites as passive or ignorant. But the historical record suggests something different: pragmatism. As imperial oversight declined, peasants shifted crops to suit local conditions and markets, hoarded or hid surplus from collectors, formed informal trading networks with nearby communities, changed settlement patterns, moving closer to strongholds or religious sites for safety. Where once they paid taxes in kind or coin, many now paid in labor or loyalty to a local patron. Archaeological evidence shows an increase in small-scale mills, local pottery workshops, and mixed farming. It wasn't prosperity, but it was survival. In the absence of centralized logistics, people created patchwork economies less efficient, but more responsive. Traders and the rise of the gray market. With official trade disrupted by war, piracy, or bureaucracy, informal networks emerged. Merchants who once worked within regulated systems now bartered directly with communities or monasteries, traveled with private guards instead of relying on Roman protection, forged new routes that bypassed official checkpoints, traded in smaller, more portable goods like salt, spices, cloth, or wine. These were not shadowy black market operators. They were essential intermediaries in a world where official systems had ground to a halt. Roman officials often tolerated or quietly enabled these traders because, in many cases, they were the only ones keeping the economy moving. The logistics of the church. As imperial bureaucracy weakened, one institution began to pick up the pieces: the Christian church. The church didn't just spread theology, it spread infrastructure. Monasteries grew their own food, stored grain, and maintained roads. Bishops mediated disputes, organized famine relief, and negotiated with invaders. Clergy preserved literacy, enabling contracts, records, and correspondence. In effect, the church became a kind of parallel logistics network, one that didn't rely on imperial funding. Monasteries were often self-sustaining hubs producing wine, oil, flour, and even tools. They took in refugees, ran schools, and managed local resources. Some scholars argue that, without the church's logistical capabilities, many towns would have collapsed entirely in the 5th and 6th centuries. It wasn't that the church had a grand plan, it's that someone had to keep things moving. Small innovations that changed survival. When big systems collapse, small technologies matter. In the late Roman period, several subtle shifts helped people survive without imperial support. Hand mills, querns, became more common for households. Barrels finally replaced amphorae as the dominant transport vessel, especially in the north. Two-field crop rotation helped improve yields in areas once dependent on state grain. Local metalworking spread, with smaller forges creating tools, nails, and plows. These weren't revolutionary breakthroughs, but they compensated for lost centralization. And they show how ordinary people, far from being helpless, were constantly adjusting, tinkering, and rebalancing their world. A world without the empire. By the late 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was mostly gone in political terms, but many of its systems lingered. The Eastern Empire Byzantium continued shipping grain and wine across the Mediterranean, but in the West, life had taken on a post-imperial character. People no longer expected the state to provide food or transport. Taxes, if paid at all, went to local warlords or bishops. Cities became fortified villages, often centered on a cathedral or lord's house. The large-scale economy was replaced by microeconomies. What had been a globalized system was now a patchwork of local survival zones. The empire didn't end with a bang, but with a shifting of gears. Final thought. Rome taught the world how to build complex logistics, but perhaps its greater lesson is in what happens when those logistics fail. Survival didn't come from heroism or revolution. It came from adjustment, scale back, and quiet improvisation. In that way, the fall of Rome is not just a story of decline. It's a story of resilience, how people continued to grow food, bake bread, press oil, and drink wine, even when the empire that once guaranteed these things was gone. But here's the question. If people adapted so effectively, why didn't they try to rebuild the system? What stopped them from creating a new Rome? In the previous sections, we explored the massive logistical machinery of the Roman Empire, the roads, ships, warehouses, and scribes that kept wine and grain flowing across thousands of miles. Then we looked at what happened when that system began to break down. Local adaptation, the rise of self-sufficiency, the quiet ingenuity of farmers and merchants. But one question remains. If people adapted so well, why didn't they rebuild the system? Why didn't they remake Rome? The answer, like much of history, lies not in grand failures, but in accumulated limitations. This final section is about those limits, the practical, psychological, and structural barriers that prevented the post-Roman world from becoming a new empire. Because sometimes, survival gets in the way of rebuilding. The loss of scale. Rome's logistics functioned because the empire had scale. It controlled Egypt's grain, Spain's silver, Gaul's wine, and Syria's trade routes. This allowed for long-distance redistribution of food, centralized tax collection, state-managed roads and ports, continental communication. When the empire fractured, so did that scale. Now, instead of one empire, there were dozens of competing kingdoms, warlords, and localized polities. Each had its own currency or none at all, its own military priorities, little interest in sharing resources with neighbors. A local bishop in Gaul might have access to surplus wine, but no incentive or ability to trade it to a starving town in Italy. The idea of rebuilding a pan-Mediterranean system was practically impossible. There was no authority to organize it, and no trust between the new powers to sustain it. The shrinking of ambition. There's another reason Rome wasn't rebuilt. People stopped wanting to. After generations of instability, civil war, famine, and shifting rulers, people began to lower their expectations of the state. They no longer expected centralized grain distribution, imperial tax forgiveness during bad harvests, regular maintenance of roads or ports. Instead, they looked to local patrons, landowners, or clergy for protection and provision. This wasn't foolishness, it was rational realism. In a world of uncertainty, it made more sense to strengthen local ties, keep surplus nearby, rely on people you knew. Over time, this created a mental shift. People stopped thinking in terms of empires and started thinking in terms of regions, counties, parishes, and manors. The idea of empire, of centralized order, became a memory, not a goal. The knowledge bottleneck. Roman logistics depended on more than labor and materials. It required knowledge of weights and measures, ability to conduct long-distance accounting, literacy in Latin, especially for contracts and shipping manifests, standardized tax codes and transport rules. As imperial schools collapsed and administrative networks decayed, that knowledge atrophied. Fewer people could calculate large-scale shipments. Bookkeeping became inconsistent. Latin began to fracture into regional dialects. Complex legal texts became incomprehensible. Even if someone wanted to rebuild Rome's logistics, they would have faced a simple problem. The instruction manual was lost. Infrastructure without maintenance. Rome had great roads, ports, aqueducts, and granaries, but they all shared one weakness: they required maintenance. And maintenance required taxes, trained labor, coordinated logistics, political stability. Without those things, even the best-built systems begin to fail. Roads became impassable due to erosion or overgrowth. Bridges collapsed and were not rebuilt. Harbors silted up. Warehouses fell into disrepair. The infrastructure was still there, but like abandoned machinery, it became useless without upkeep. Some places, like Constantinople in the East, maintained their systems for centuries. But in the West, infrastructure quietly returned to the earth. Military fragmentation. Rome's logistics were designed in part to support its military machine. Troops could be moved, fed, paid, and armed because there was a functioning supply chain. When that chain broke, armies became localized militias, mercenary bands, personal retinues of lords. No one had the reach or resources to raise and support legion across hundreds of miles. This meant that any attempt to rebuild the empire faced a fatal problem. No army could enforce it. In a fragmented military landscape, power became territorial, not continental. The power of the church and its limits. The church was the most organized institution to survive the empire's fall. It had literacy, property, moral authority, a network of clergy across Europe. And yet, the church never tried to fully recreate the Roman state. Instead, it built a parallel world. Cathedrals instead of capitals, monasteries instead of provinces, bishops instead of bureaucrats. The church stabilized, but it did not centralize. It preserved books, built roads, stored grain, but only for its own use or its immediate community. And when it did reach for secular power, like in the Papal States or through canon law, it did so with a different logic than Rome. The church became a moral empire, not a logistical one. Attempts at restoration. That said, not everyone gave up on rebuilding Rome. In the 6th century, Justinian I, emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, launched wars to recapture Italy and North Africa. His generals succeeded temporarily, but the cost was immense and the logistical system couldn't sustain it. In the 9th century, Charlemagne was crowned emperor of the Romans by the Pope. He built roads, minted coins, and tried to centralize rule, but even his empire fragmented within a generation. The Holy Roman Empire, centuries later, took the name but not the logistics. Each attempt stumbled not because of ambition, but because no one could recreate the machinery, the daily grind of shipping amphorae, tracking tax receipts, feeding soldiers, and repairing roads. Without that machinery, the dream of Rome was just that, a dream. The long view. In time, something new did emerge. Feudalism, manorial economies, guild systems, merchant leagues. But these weren't reconstructions of Rome, they were responses to its absence. And ironically, the later rise of early modern states in the 15th-17th centuries, France, Spain, England, would eventually recreate some elements of Roman centralization. Standing armies, national taxation, postal systems, standardized roads. But by then the world had changed. The printing press, gunpowder, and the Black Death had reshaped Europe. The logistical genius of Rome was not forgotten. It was simply too far ahead of its time to be reborn in the world that followed. Final reflection. When Rome's system collapsed, people didn't panic. They adjusted, they localized, they survived. But survival and innovation are not the same. The lesson of Rome's wine, grain, and goods is this: complex systems depend on fragile connections. Once broken, those systems are nearly impossible to rebuild. What comes after is never the same and never really wants to be. In the end, no one rebuilt Rome's logistics because Rome's world was gone. What replaced it was smaller, slower, and more human-scaled. It was less efficient but more flexible, less glorious but more durable. Sometimes in history, the systems that matter most are the ones no one sees until they're gone.